Chapter 12. Turning Point. This is a serious course upon which we embark. Truman to Congress, 1947. 1. Was Harry Truman an ordinary provincial American sadly miscast in the presidency? Or was he a man of above-average, even exceptional qualities and character, who had the makings of greatness? "What a test of democracy if it works," Roy Roberts of the Kansas City Star had written on Truman's first day in office. Now, less than 2 years later, Walter Lippmann, like a great many others, was convinced the test had not worked. To Lippmann, regarded as the most thoughtful, authoritative political commentator of the time, Truman was an embarrassment. His bravado and quick decisions, Lippmann thought, were a facade for an essentially insecure man filled with anxieties. How could the affairs of the country be conducted by a president who not only had lost the support of his party but was no longer in command of his administration? In the years on the farm, when courting Bess, his first campaign, Truman himself had professed to being only a common everyday fellow. He could promise her no more. But he had written also that every farmer thinks he's as good as the president or perhaps a little better, meaning that by the old Jeffersonian faith in which he had been raised, what was ordinary grassroots American was as good as the best. Questioned once by a reporter whether he considered himself the sublimation of the average man, Truman rejected the fancy phrase and asked in turn, "Well, what is wrong with being the average man?" Since 1945, numbers of others had judged him as anything but ordinary. At Potsdam, Churchill immediately perceived the new president to be a man of immense determination, and in the fateful spring of 1947, from Chartwell, his home south of London, where he was busy with his memoirs, Churchill would write to tell "My dear Harry" how much he admired "what you have done for the peace and freedom of the world." For Churchill, the presidency of Harry Truman had become the one cause for hope in the world. Dean Acheson, who could be extremely hard, even contemptuous in his judgment of men he did not consider his equals, had described Truman after Roosevelt's death as straightforward, decisive, honest, and, if inexperienced, likely to learn fast. And in the time since, Acheson had found no reason to think differently. On the morning in November 1946, when Truman arrived at Washington's Union Station, his political stock at an all-time low, Acheson alone of all the administration was waiting on the platform to greet him, a gesture that Truman, understandably, never forgot. Acheson looked at Truman as a leader. "The captain with the mighty heart," Acheson would call him. Arthur Kroc of the New York Times, foremost of Washington correspondents, was another who had seen something very good and human and courageous in this unlikely president, and at a point when many political commentators were ready to write him off. Felix Belair, White House correspondent for the Times, had decided that while Truman might look as much like the average guy on the streetcar as ever, he was a man to rise to the occasion. So, testament from experienced observers that this was a president of considerable substance, and that it would be a mistake to count him out, was already plentiful, even before the great change that came in 1947. David E. Lilienthal, whom Truman had earlier reappointed head of the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, was a trim, agreeable-looking man in his mid-40s, the son of Jewish immigrants, a graduate of DePaul University and the Harvard Law School, and regarded still as a model New Dealer. TVA was a huge success. It had built dams, created lakes, forests, new industries, new farming methods, brought electricity to some 700,000 users, and during the war fueled the giant uranium plants at Oak Ridge. And Lilienthal, as much as anyone, had made TVA. Unlike so many New Dealers who had quit since Roosevelt's death, who had fled government, as Clark Clifford said, so fast they were falling all over each other, Lilienthal had chosen to stay, not once, but twice. In October he had resigned from TVA to become Truman's designated, though still unconfirmed, head of the new Atomic Energy Commission, which Truman insisted be under civilian control. It was a position potentially as important as almost any in post-war Washington, and one for which Lilienthal felt himself inadequately qualified. But then who was qualified? And the president had been extremely persuasive and patient while Lilienthal went through days of soul-searching. Hard-working, articulate, Lilienthal was an exceptionally able man, if by some people's standards overly liberal, and his presence in the administration, like that of Burns, Marshall, Harriman, who had returned from London to replace Henry Wallace at the Department of Commerce, Acheson, Bolin, and Clark Clifford, belied the whole idea that Truman had surrounded himself only with Missouri fools and mediocrities. Lilienthal did not entirely approve of Truman's performance thus far. As a liberal, he had been so shattered by Truman's call to draft the striking rail workers that after hearing Truman's speech over the radio, Lilienthal walked out into his garden in Tennessee and stood in a drenching rain, hoping it might wash away his misery. Still, Lilienthal had faith in Truman, faith in the man, because Truman had shown such faith in him, but also because he saw qualities of courage and candor rare in a politician. Indeed, he felt better about working for the Truman administration, Lilienthal said, than he had working for Roosevelt, because now he could get straight answers. Since November, Lilienthal had been extremely concerned about the effect so humiliating a defeat in the elections might have on Truman's self-confidence, and thus on his program. Lilienthal's own appointment, as a prime example, was bound to stir up a hornet's nest once the confirmation process began on the Hill, since the aging vituperative Senator McKellar of Tennessee, who had fought to deny Lilienthal's reappointment at TVA and despised him no less than ever, had just been re-elected to another term. Not for a month after the elections did Lilienthal actually see the president, and then only by chance. It was at about 5 o'clock on an afternoon in early December when Lilienthal and Clifford were working quietly in the cabinet room. The day was nearly over. It was growing dark outside. Clifford nudged him to look up at the French doors that opened to the outside passage to the main house. The president was standing on the other side of the glass, looking in at them and smiling. Not knowing what else to do, Lilienthal rose and bowed awkwardly. Truman waved, still smiling, then moved quickly on, a Secret Service man a half-step behind. Nothing had been said. The whole incident occupied only seconds. But to Lilienthal it was a moment of encouragement worth recording in his diary, as he would also record the hearty welcome Truman gave him a few days later in the Oval Office, when, with the 4 others on his new commission, Lilienthal came to make a brief progress report. The Army would relinquish no more control over atomic energy than it could possibly avoid, Truman warned. "I know how they are. They are trained not to give up. I know because I am one of them." Again he was smiling. As the meeting ended and the group wished the president luck, Truman, thanking them, replied that his luck had been improving lately, this in reference to a recent test of wills with John L. Lewis. But what impressed Lilienthal was the kind of grim gaiety in his tone and manner. The change in the president became more obvious by the day. There had been a showdown with John L. Lewis just after the November elections. At Clark Clifford's urging, Truman had challenged the legality of still another threatened coal strike, except this time it was to be a fight to the finish, as Truman said. "Oh, God, it was the chance of a lifetime," Clifford would remember. "Be right, be strong. Nobody's bigger than the President of the United States. All the signs were right. It looked like Lewis had violated the law. Roosevelt had toadied to him time and again. But now he pushed the President the wrong way. And he just said one day, 'Okay, we're going to go.'" The administration took the powerful labor boss to court on the grounds that he was violating the Smith-Connolly Act, which prohibited strikes against government-held facilities, the coal mines being still technically under government seizure. An injunction was served, and when Lewis let the strike begin on November 20th, a federal district judge ordered him to stand trial for contempt. Lewis refused. On December 4th, the judge hit the United Mine Workers with a stunning $3 million fine and fined Lewis personally $10,000. Truman, meanwhile, had been to Florida and back for a few days of vacation at the Key West Naval Base. On December 7th, Lewis gave up and ordered his men back to the mines, pending an appeal to the Supreme Court. In March 1947, the Supreme Court upheld the contempt ruling, though the fine against the Union was later reduced. It was a resounding victory for the administration and another step up for Clifford. Established now in Sam Rosenman's old office, the second largest and best office in the West Wing, Clifford was only 20 paces from the president's desk and saw him 6 or 7 times a day. Often they ate together in the basement lunchroom. Truman was hugely pleased by the collapse of Lewis. For the first time in months he was being praised by the press. "Harry S. Truman stood fast where Franklin Roosevelt met Lewis halfway," said Newsweek, and this too, of course, he greatly enjoyed. But the real change in the view of his old friend Charlie Ross and others had come with the elections. It was the sweeping Republican triumph, ironically, that had given Truman a new lease on life, freeing him at last from the shadow of Franklin Roosevelt as perhaps nothing else could have. He owed no one anything any longer. He was free to take charge, to be himself, and show what he could do if he had to. He was on his own again, much as he had been in the 1940 Senate race, when Tom Pendergast was out of the picture and Roosevelt had abandoned him, or as he had been on the farm when his father died, or in France in 1918 when, with his new captain's bars, he stood alone, trembling and speechless before his new command. The president was now a free man and can write a fine record, Ross wrote to his sister. The real Truman administration, Ross told White House reporters, began the day after the elections. And clearly Truman agreed. In a letter to Bess from Key West, he had vowed, "I'm doing as I damn please for the next 2 years, and to hell with all of them." Far from being downcast or tentative about his new role as a minority president, he had returned from Florida tanned, rested, eager to get going. He had accepted the verdict of the people in the spirit, he said, that all good citizens accept the results of any fair election. The change in Congress did not alter the country's domestic or foreign problems, and in foreign affairs especially it must be a national and not a party program. Of course, conflicts would arise between a Republican Congress and a Democratic president. That was to be expected. But he, Harry Truman, would be guided by a simple idea: to do in all cases, without regard to political considerations, what seems to me to be for the welfare of all our people. In the new 80th Congress, Joe Martin would replace Sam Rayburn as Speaker of the House. In the Senate, instead of Alban Barkley, Taft and Vandenberg would hold the reins of power, and with the tacit understanding that Taft would attend to domestic issues, Vandenberg to foreign affairs as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. Truman knew the three Republican leaders from years of experience. Vandenberg, whom he knew best and liked best, had been a friend since Truman's first days in the Senate, and Truman considered him both able and trustworthy. A former newspaper editor from Grand Rapids, Van had been an all-out isolationist until the war, but Pearl Harbor, he liked to say, had ended isolationism for any realist. Once in London, during an attack of German robot bombs, Vandenberg remarked to a friend, "How can there be immunity or isolation when men can devise weapons like that?" It was a conversion of far-reaching consequence. Not only was Vandenberg one of the Senate's inner circle, and among Republicans the undisputed authority on foreign affairs, but he was a formidable force as a speaker. Large and hearty, he had the mannerisms of a somewhat pompous stage senator, the cigar, the florid phrase, and more than a little vanity, carefully combing a few long strands of gray hair sideways over the top of his bald head. When making a point on the Senate floor, he favored the broad gesture, grandly flinging out one arm in a sweeping arc. His prestige reached beyond national boundaries, and like Truman during his years in the Senate, he had made no enemies. Vandenberg was the son of a harness maker, Joe Martin the son of a blacksmith, backgrounds Truman could identify with, as he could not with the privileged world of Robert A. Taft, whose father had been President William Howard Taft. Martin, who came from North Attleboro, Massachusetts, a factory town south of Boston, had arrived in Congress first in 1925, when his friend Calvin Coolidge was president. And for 42 years Martin's outlook had remained fundamentally that of Coolidge. No legislation of importance had been attached to his name, no memorable declaration of political philosophy, but he was a good cloakroom organizer and known as dependable and fair-minded, straight as a string, as was said in the home district. A short, square man, he wore poorly-fitting three-piece navy blue suits and boxy black policeman's shoes. Even when speaking to small groups at home, he would stand on a chair in order to be seen. A lock of dark hair that fell over the right side of his forehead had become a trademark. Like his Democratic counterpart, Sam Rayburn, Martin was a bachelor. He neither drank, nor smoked, nor showed much interest in anything beyond politics and the hometown newspaper he owned, the North Attleboro Chronicle. Whatever was good for the district, Joe Martin held, was pretty much good for the nation. On New Year's Day, busy placing calls to his cabinet to wish them a Happy New Year, Truman decided to phone Vandenberg and Martin as well, and was encouraged by the results. Vandenberg was very pleasant, Martin even more so, assuring the president that cooperation was uppermost in his mind. "He told me that he would be most happy to talk to me any time on any subject," Truman recorded. "I'm inclined to believe that he meant what he said." Taft, whom Truman did not call New Year's Day, was a remote, self-absorbed man, a cold fish in the view of many. "Bob is not austere," his wife once explained. "He's just departmentalized." Younger than Truman by 5 years, Taft had been born into affluent, cultivated surroundings in Cincinnati. He had stood first in his class at Yale and later at the Harvard Law School. Although he had served in the Senate since 1938, he looked more like a banker than a politician. He wore rimless spectacles and, like Harry Truman, his hat at dead center. His Cheshire Cat grin was famous. Often tactless, habitually brusque with those less intelligent than he, Taft was a poor mixer, a poor public speaker. He had trouble remembering names. His reputation for hard work and standing by principle, however, his fund of knowledge and ability to cut to the heart of an issue were considered second to none in the Senate. He was Mr. Republican, incorruptible, extremely conservative, and, unlike Vandenberg, a confirmed isolationist. But he could also be highly independent and exasperate the old guard of his party by advocating such liberal programs as federal aid to education, health, and housing. Senator Wallace H. White of Maine, a quiet, colorless figure, was to be the Republican majority leader in name only. Taft would be the one running things. Taft, Vandenberg, and Martin were all determined to restore Congress to the prestige and authority that had been lost during the Roosevelt era. Martin would insist in his first address as Speaker, "Our American concept of government rests upon the idea of a dominant Congress." All three men, furthermore, were considered presidential prospects for 1948, and Taft in particular. Determined to follow in his father's footsteps, Taft had already tried for the Republican nomination in 1940. Now, with Harry Truman in office, his opportunity looked greater than ever. Nor, importantly, was Taft interested in cooperating with the administration. "The purpose of the opposition is to oppose," he was fond of saying. And unlike Vandenberg and Martin, he had little regard for Truman, who to Taft was truly an ordinary man, deficient in background and education, ill-equipped in nearly every way for so heavy a responsibility, in addition to being overly susceptible to the bad advice of liberals. Among the new faces in Republican ranks in the 80th Congress were Representative Richard M. Nixon of California, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr. of Massachusetts, and Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin. Among the relative handful of new Democrats elected was Representative John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts, the 29-year-old son of Joe Kennedy. For all the labor strife of the year before, the country was prospering as it never had, just as Truman declared in his State of the Union message on January 6, 1947. Food production was at a new high. The national income was higher than ever before in peacetime. "We have virtually full employment," he said with satisfaction. He looked like a man befitting the message, healthy and purposeful. At 7 that morning he had walked from the White House to Union Station to meet the train from Missouri bringing Bess and Margaret, who sat now listening in the gallery. He called for far-ranging improvements in labor management relations, a strengthening of the antitrust laws, a national health insurance program, including support for mental health, child care, and hospital construction. He wanted a fair level of return for farmers, aid to veterans, an aggressive pattern of home construction. He promised new progress in civil rights. In no way was the speech a retreat from the domestic programs he had set forth in his message of 1945. Yet the tone was different, more reasoning, more optimistic. He advocated a balanced budget, a streamlining of the military establishment, international control of atomic energy. He ended with what would later seem a prescient line about sharing America's bounty with the war-stricken peoples of the world. Also, notably missing this time was any mention of Franklin Roosevelt. Written in large part by Clark Clifford with help from George Elsey, who, like Clifford, was in naval uniform no longer but serving as Clifford's assistant, the speech went far to raise Truman's standing with Congress. Even greater was the effect of the surprise announcement he made at the White House the following evening. George C. Marshall was to be the new Secretary of State. Jimmy Burns had resigned. Marshall was already en route from China. The appointment of Marshall was one of the best, most important decisions of Truman's presidency. One wonders, as Truman must have in later years, how differently history might have unfolded had Marshall declined to serve as Secretary of State at that particular moment in world affairs. The reaction everywhere was immediate, virtually unanimous approval. Henry Stimson might have been speaking for the whole nation when he wrote to Marshall, "Your appointment as Secretary of State has filled me with a great sense of security so far as our country is concerned. Mr. Truman made a wise as well as a very shrewd appointment." On Capitol Hill, Arthur Vandenberg pushed the nomination through the Foreign Relations Committee without a hearing or opposition, and by calling for a suspension of the rules, ran it through the Senate for unanimous approval the same day. The one possible shadow on the appointment, in view of some Republicans, was the chance that it might set Marshall up as a future candidate for president, an idea Marshall himself put to rest the same morning he arrived in Washington. He would never be a candidate for any political office, he said, and being Marshall, he was taken at his word. He was sworn in at the White House by Chief Justice Vinson later that morning, Tuesday, January 21, 1947. When a beaming Truman shook his hand and said how much he appreciated Marshall's willingness to accept this burden, Marshall replied simply that he would do his best. At 66, George C. Marshall was the first career soldier to become Secretary of State. He had been born on the last day of 1880 in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, south of Pittsburgh, where through boyhood, from his businessman father, he heard repeated accounts of his distinguished Virginia ancestry, including the distantly related John Marshall, the great Chief Justice. "I thought that the continuing harping on the name John Marshall was kind of poor business," he later said. "It was about time for somebody else to swim for the family." Graduated from the Virginia Military Institute in 1901, he was commissioned a second lieutenant in the infantry and advanced steadily thereafter, serving in the Philippines, Oklahoma Territory, and Fort Leavenworth, until World War I, when, as Pershing's aide, he directed the American advance to the Argonne. Between the wars, he had served 3 years in China. In 1939, Roosevelt made him Chief of Staff. He was slightly under 6 feet tall, with sandy gray, close-cropped hair and light blue eyes. His long face, with its long upper lip, had a homespun fatherly quality, and often in repose he looked quite sad. With age, his shoulders had begun to stoop slightly. As Dean Acheson would write, there was little military glamour about him, nothing pretentious. Rather, it was an intangible aura that affected people. Like George Washington, with whom he was often compared, Marshall was a figure of such flawless rectitude and self-command, he both inspired awe and made description difficult. Churchill called him the noblest Roman. Bill Hassett on Truman's staff spoke of the reverence Marshall inspired. Imperturbable under pressure, the imperturbability of a good conscience, George Kennan called it, invariably courteous, he was without a trace of petty vanity or self-serving ambition. As one of his staff at the State Department later wrote, Marshall did not possess the intellectual brilliance of someone like Acheson, or the gift of eloquence, but he could distinguish what was important from what was unimportant, and this made him invaluable. Acheson liked to recall in later years that the moment Marshall entered a room one could feel his presence. It was a striking and commanding force. His figure conveyed intensity, which his voice, low, staccato, and incisive, reinforced. It compelled respect. It spread a sense of authority and calm. At the Pentagon, some lower-ranking officers had been known to exit from Marshall's office backwards, and no one of any rank, not even the President, called him George, only General Marshall, a title, as Acheson said, that suited him as though he had been baptized with it. Once, reportedly, when Roosevelt had called him George, he responded, "It's General Marshall, Mr. President." Truman described Marshall as astute, profound, and more of a listener than a talker. "He never made any speeches at you," Truman would gratefully recall. Sometimes he would sit for an hour with little or no expression on his face, but when he had heard enough, he would come up with a statement of his own that would invariably cut to the very bone of the matter under discussion. But it was Marshall's rock-bound sense of duty, his selflessness and honesty that Truman especially prized. He was a man you could count on to be truthful in every way, and when you find somebody like that, you have to hang on to them. As Truman the politician also appreciated, Marshall stood high with Republicans on the Hill in a way almost no one else did, and this irrespective of the fact that he had worked so closely through the war with the Democrat they all liked least, Franklin Roosevelt. It had been Marshall who got the first peacetime draft past Congress, Marshall who had confided the secret of the atomic bomb to the congressional leadership, trusting them to keep the secret. For Marshall, his recent mission to China had been a heavy disappointment. Trying to mediate a peace between the two Chinas of the nationalist Kuomintang government under Chiang Kai-shek and the communists of Mao Zedong, he had achieved only a tentative ceasefire. "I hate failure," he told a friend. But failure was what he had had to announce on the eve of his departure from China. On the one hand, the leaders of the government are strongly opposed to a communistic form of government, he reported. On the other, the communists frankly state that they are Marxists and intend to work toward establishing a communistic form of government in China. His efforts with the Kuomintang had been frustrating in the extreme. It was a government riddled with corruption, overburdened with too many generals. "Though I speak as a soldier, I must deplore the dominating influence of the military." But the communists fostered only chaos and violent anti-American propaganda, and with more than 1 million men under arms, their power was gaining. Marshall had failed in his mission to China, yet no one blamed him for the failure. Such was the scale of the problem and his own reputation. No one looked on his new assignment as anything but a very large step forward for the troubled Truman administration. Marshall assumed his new duties at once, and at once the difference was felt. Jimmy Burns had been a hard-working Secretary of State and more effective than generally acknowledged, or than Truman would portray him in his later reflections. But Burns had been maddeningly independent, determined to do everything himself, and continuously, incurably on the move. In 546 days as Secretary, Burns had been away 241, and had shown little interest in the department itself. Under Marshall, all that changed. He gave a sense of purpose and direction. His personality infected the whole Foreign Service, Bolin remembered. There was greater clarity in the operation than I had ever seen before, and Marshall never forgot, as Burns did, that Truman was president. With Truman's blessing, a new policy planning staff was established under the brilliant George Kennan, who had been recalled from Moscow. Organization overall was made more orderly and efficient. When section heads fell into dispute in his presence, Marshall would tell them, "Gentlemen, don't fight the problem, solve it." Atchison, who had wished to return to private life, was persuaded to stay on as undersecretary for another 6 months. Atchison found working with the general such a joy, wrote David Lilienthal after a dinner at Atchison's Georgetown home, that he could hardly talk about anything else. Marshall, like Truman, was decisive. When Atchison informed Marshall that the State Department had outgrown its quarters in the old Victorian structure beside the White House, and that a new building was available near the Potomac in the section called Foggy Bottom, Marshall said, "Move." To no one was Marshall's presence more reassuring or inspiriting than to Truman. "The more I see and talk to him, the more certain I am he's the great one of the age," Truman wrote not long after Marshall's swearing-in. "Marshall is a tower of strength and common sense," he noted privately another time. It was admiration such as Truman felt for no other public figure, no one he had ever known, not Roosevelt, not Churchill, not anyone. Nor was he at all hesitant or concerned over having such a strong-minded man as his Secretary of State. Marshall, Harriman, Patterson, Forrestal, Lilienthal, Eisenhower, they were all strong-minded. Conceivably, Truman could have worried that someone of such immense reputation as Marshall in so prominent a role would diminish his own standing with the country, that he might suffer by comparison, and Marshall be perceived as more the sort of man who ought to be president. But Truman was neither jealous nor intimidated. He was not so constructed. "I am surely lucky to have his friendship and support," he wrote, and that was that. By early February 1947, White House reporters were commenting on the president's greater ease and relaxation. "He no longer moans to every visitor that he doesn't want the job and never did," wrote Joseph Alsop to a friend. After a social call on the president, the former heavyweight boxing champion, Gene Tunney, said he had never seen a more solid citizen. "His eye is clear and he is just as solid as a wall. His jaw is square and his stomach is just as flat as an athlete's." Truman's popularity in the polls, due in large measure to Marshall's presence, was back up to 48%. The whole atmosphere was different. Truman had opened the White House to sightseers again after a 6-year wartime ban on all but official callers. He and Bess reinstated formal receptions and state dinners for the first time since 1941, and the contrast between the Trumans at home in their private quarters and their official social life was amazing. The president, with his sense of history, wanted White House entertainment done just so, done to the minute, by rules that had not changed in half a century, except in wartime. "They brought back all the pageantry," Assistant Head Usher J.B. West remembered approvingly, "all the formality, all the pomp that we had all but forgotten how to execute. We, the White House staff, had to work out the details so that all the president and his wife had to do was to be in the right place at the right time. For a reception, they'd march down the stairs to the Blue Room and receive the guests, and then march back upstairs. But behind the scenes, we spent weeks of preparation and scheduling for each detail of that right place and right time." Attendance at the first reception to honor the Supreme Court on December 10th had been 1,333. Dress was white tie. The Marine Band played. "The papers say today that Bess and I have shaken hands with 7,000 people this season," Truman wrote to his mother on February 9th. At a full-dress affair for Senator Vandenberg in the state dining room, the gold service was used. The night of the diplomatic reception, again, more than 1,000 attended. Before the war, only about 500 people in total had been accredited to the embassies and legations in Washington. For one occasion, Truman asked Eugene List, the concert pianist, to perform for the customers. And again, as at Potsdam, Liszt played the president's favorite Chopin waltz in A minor, but this time without the president's help as page-turner. "I was somewhat nervous through the entertainment," Truman told his mother, "because Mr. Krim the usher and Jim Rowley, of the Secret Service, came and told me that the engineers had found that the chain holding the center chandelier was stretching. I let the show go and ordered the thing down the next day. If it had fallen, I'd been in a real fix." Truman was glad to see Lent arrive and put an end to such affairs, he told his mother. He was tired of smirking at people I don't like. On February 19th, in another letter to Grandview, he could report that the season was over, thank goodness. But the truth was, he had had a fine time, every time. J.B. West would remember that, despite all the denying in the world, which he did, we could see the president enjoyed it. He was an extrovert, a friendly man, and he liked company. Hearings on the Lilienthal nomination were causing a sensation, meanwhile, with Senator Kenneth McKellar insisting TVA was a hotbed of communism and that David E. Lilienthal was more than a little suspect. The senator thought it was General Groves who had discovered the secret of splitting the atom and failed to understand why Groves should not therefore be left in command of his discovery. Looking down from the bench, the senator asked Lilienthal where his parents had been born. When Lilienthal was unable to answer with certainty, McKellar acted as though he had scored an important point. He pressed the issue again another day. This time, Lilienthal said he had been able to determine only that it had been in Austro-Hungary, somewhere near Pressburg, in what had since become Czechoslovakia. Again, McKellar smiled at the audience as if everything were going his way, Czechoslovakia being under Soviet influence. But when he turned and abruptly asked Lilienthal to explain his views on the communistic doctrine, the answer Lilienthal gave held the room spellbound. With his hands folded on the table in front of him, Lilienthal spoke for several minutes, his eyes not on McKellar or the committee, but on a spot somewhere just above his hands, almost as though he were talking to himself. He had felt a kind of smoldering within, he later wrote, far from anger or temper, but some emotional tempo quite different, but definitely emotional. As he talked, he kept saying to himself, "Don't deny, affirm." "I believe in," he said, "and I conceive the Constitution of the United States to rest, as does religion, upon the fundamental proposition of the integrity of the individual, and that all government and all private institutions must be designed to promote and protect and defend the integrity and the dignity of the individual. Any forms of government, therefore, and any other institutions which make men means rather than ends in themselves, which exalt that state or any other institutions above the importance of men, which place arbitrary power over men as a fundamental tenet of government, are contrary to this conception, and therefore I am deeply opposed to them. The fundamental tenet of communism is that the state is an end in itself, and that therefore the powers which the state exercises over the individual are without any ethical standards to limit them. That I deeply disbelieve. It is very easy simply to say one is not a communist, and of course if, despite my record, it is necessary for me to state this very affirmatively, then this is a great disappointment to me. It is very easy to talk about being against communism. It is equally important to believe those things which provide a satisfactory and effective alternative. Democracy is that satisfying alternative. And its hope in the world is that it is an affirmative belief, rather than simply a belief against something else. I deeply believe in the capacity of democracy to surmount any trials that may lie ahead, provided only we practice it in our daily lives. And among the things that we must practice is this, that while we seek fervently to ferret out the subversive and anti-democratic forces in the country, we do not at the same time, by hysteria, by resort to innuendo and sneers and other unfortunate tactics, besmirch the very cause that we believe in and cause a separation among our people, cause one group and one individual to hate one another based upon mere attacks, mere unsubstantiated attacks upon their loyalty. Hearsay and gossip had no place in courts of justice. If the principles of protection of an individual and his good name against gossip and hearsay were not upheld by legislatures in their investigating activities, that too would be a failure of the democratic ideal. Then, pausing, he unfolded his hands and said, "This I deeply believe." For a moment the room was silent. Then, almost in a rush, members of the committee and people from the audience began crowding around him to praise Lilienthal for what he had said. From the White House, Truman let Lilienthal know that he would not only stand behind the nomination, but was in the fight with all he had, if it took 150 years. In the days following, a strain of anti-Semitism in the opposition to the appointment became increasingly apparent. Then, without warning and without waiting for the committee report to reach the floor, Senator Taft announced he would oppose the nomination on the grounds that Lilienthal was not only a typical power-hungry bureaucrat and temperamentally unfitted for the job of heading the Atomic Energy Commission, but soft on the subject of communism. Until this point it had been McKellar's show, and thus largely personal and predictable. In earlier days the senator had seen communists behind the anti-poll tax bill, too. But now, with Mr. Republican stepping in, it became a distinctly partisan issue, and, as was said, a major capital crisis. The phrase "soft on communism" caught on immediately. Lilienthal did not see how he could possibly win with the Republican majority lined up against him. The Taft speech had been a kick in the teeth. How long the confirming process might take and at what toll no one could say. "Courage, what is it?" Lilienthal asked in his diary. "Isn't it the capacity to hang on?" 2. He had been trying for days to find time to write to her, Truman told his sister in a letter in February. He was more concerned than usual about staying in touch. Mama had had a fall and fractured her hip. Truman had flown home to see her, but remained gravely worried, and concerned, too, about the burden of care on Mary Jane. "Now, Mary, don't you work too hard." If she needed help, she was to get it. "Things have been happening here in a hurry," he told her. Foreign affairs were uppermost. Marshall was to leave for Moscow in little more than a week for his first foreign ministers' conference. He himself would be flying to Mexico in 3 days for the first visit to Mexico ever by a president of the United States. "I am spending every day with Marshall going over policy and hoping we can get a lasting peace. It looks not so good right now." The date was February 27th, 1947. 6 days earlier, on the 21st, a month to the day since Marshall took up his duties as Secretary of State, an urgent formal message, a so-called blue paper from the British ambassador, Lord Inverchapel, had been delivered to the State Department. Marshall had been out of town, speaking at Princeton University's bicentennial convocation. So it was Undersecretary Atchison who telephoned Truman that afternoon. Great Britain, its financial condition worsening, could no longer provide economic and military support for Greece and Turkey. The cost was too great. The Attlee government would withdraw 40,000 troops from Greece, and all economic aid would halt as of March 31st. The United States, it was hoped, would assume the responsibility. The news was both momentous and not wholly unexpected. Britain was in desperate straits. All Europe had been hit by one of the worst winters on record. In France, the cold destroyed millions of acres of winter wheat. Snow fell in Paris for the first time in years. In Berlin, where temperatures hovered around zero, people were dying of the cold. Ice clogged the Kiel Canal from the Baltic to the North Sea. Food and fuel were scarce everywhere. In Prague, electric current was being shut off for 3 hours a day. But Britain was hit hardest, the whole country virtually snowbound. Factories and schools closed. Huge snowdrifts blocked highways and railroads, closed coal mines, and isolated hundreds of small towns. When a bus on a main coastal road ran into a 10-foot drift and a snowplow was brought to the rescue, reported the Times of London, the snowplow too was buried. "Weather threatens coal supply," read the headline in the Times on February 6th. To save power, London offices were being lit with candles, and the storms continued. On February 21st, the day of Lord Inverchapel's message, it snowed again over most of the country. On January 20th, meantime, the British government had issued an economic white paper describing Britain's position as extremely serious. That Britain would soon have to cut back on its armed forces and overseas commitments was self-evident. "The situation," wrote Walter Lippmann, "would shake the world and make our position highly vulnerable and precariously isolated." Specific warnings had been crossing Truman's desk for weeks. As early as February 3rd, the American ambassador in Athens, Lincoln McVie, reported rumors that the British were pulling out of Greece, where since 1945 their troops and money had helped maintain a royalist government in a raging civil war with communist guerrillas. On February 12th, another dispatch from McVie urged immediate consideration of American aid to Greece. A few days later, Mark Etheridge, publisher of the Louisville Courier-Journal and a member of a United Nations investigating committee, cabled from Athens that Greece was a ripe plum, ready to fall into Soviet hands. Warnings about Turkey had come even sooner. Turkey had little hope of independent survival unless it is assured of solid long-term American and British support, cabled General Walter Beadle Smith, who had replaced Averell Harriman as the American ambassador in Moscow. Truman himself, furthermore, had already made his concern for the future of Greece clear to the Greek government, if not as yet to the American people. In the fall of 1946, through Ambassador McVie, Truman had acknowledged that Greece was of vital interest to the United States and promised substantial aid to maintain its independence, providing the Greek government could show that democracy survived there, a question of considerable importance, since the Greek government, as Truman knew and later wrote, seemed to encourage irresponsible rightist groups. But while the crisis in Greece and Turkey came not without warning, the formal announcement of British withdrawal did come, as Truman said, sooner than we expected, and its very formality made it seem especially dramatic and unsettling. February 21st was a Friday. Truman asked Acheson for a report by Monday, and Acheson, Bolin, and others worked through the weekend at the old State Department, where packing boxes cluttered the halls in preparation for the move to Foggy Bottom. On Monday, Marshall and Acheson met with the President and urged immediate action to provide help for Greece, and to a lesser degree for Turkey as well. To Marshall, the British announcement of withdrawal from Greece was tantamount to British withdrawal from the whole Middle East. He, too, saw the situation as extremely serious. The sum needed for Greece alone, just for the remainder of 1947, was $250 million. Truman agreed. Greece would have to be helped quickly and with substantial amounts. But aid to Greece was only one aspect of the problem. It had been a year now since Kennan's long telegram and Churchill's Iron Curtain speech at Fulton. Something more than a simple aid bill was called for. On this, Truman, Marshall, Acheson, Clifford, virtually all who had a say in policy, were agreed. One ranking State Department official, Joseph M. Jones, urged that Secretary Marshall, not the President, go before Congress to rouse the nation to the reality of the crisis, because, as Jones wrote in an internal memorandum, Marshall was the only one in government with the prestige to make a deep impression. Things were indeed happening in a hurry, as Truman told his sister. The morning of the 27th, he called the congressional leaders to his office for a crucial meeting. They listened first to Marshall, who, in measured tones, told them, "It is not alarmist to say that we are faced with the first crisis of a series which might extend Soviet domination to Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. The choice was acting with energy or losing by default." Acheson, who thought Marshall had failed to speak with appropriate force, asked to be heard. There was no time left for a measured appraisal, Acheson said. Greece was the rotten apple that would infect the whole barrel. The Soviet Union was playing one of the greatest gambles in history at minimal cost. It did not need to win all the possibilities. When Acheson finished, according to his own later account, Vandenberg told the President in a sonorous manner that if he would say the same thing in the same way to Congress, then he, Vandenberg, would lend his support, and so would a majority on Capitol Hill, his clear implication being that aid to Greece and Turkey could be had only if Truman shocked Congress into action. But in his memoirs, for all his regard for Acheson, Truman would make no mention of Acheson's remarks or the Vandenberg response as described by Acheson. Truman said only that Marshall had made it quite plain that the choice was to act or lose by default, and I expressed my emphatic agreement to this. The meeting ended at noon. Nothing was disclosed of what had been said. The crowds in Mexico City were such as Truman had never experienced. Hundreds of thousands of people poured into the streets to see and cheer an American president for the first time. The trip had been Truman's idea, and the acclaim was thrilling. He returned the vivas of the throngs. One woman shouted, "Viva Missouri," and several times broke away from his Mexican and Secret Service escorts to shake hands with people. "I have never had such a welcome in my life," he told the Mexican legislature, to whom he pledged anew Roosevelt's good neighbor policy. To a crowd of American citizens later, he said he hoped they would remember that they, too, were ambassadors. The next morning, he announced suddenly that he wished to make an unscheduled stop at Mexico City's historic Chapultepec Castle, where with one simple, unheralded gesture, he did more to improve Mexican-American relations than had any president in a century. Within hours, as the word spread, he had become a hero. The long motorcade pulled into the shade of an ancient grove of trees. Truman stepped out of his black Lincoln and walked to a stone monument bearing the names of Los Niños Héroes, the child heroes, 6 teenage cadets who died in the Mexican-American War in 1847, when American troops stormed the castle. According to legend, 5 of the cadets had stabbed themselves, and a 6th jumped to his death from a parapet rather than surrender. As Truman approached, a contingent of blue-uniformed Mexican cadets stood at attention. As he placed a floral wreath at the foot of the monument, several of the cadets wept silently. After bowing his head for a few minutes, Truman returned to the line of cars, where the Mexican chauffeurs were already shaking hands with their American passengers. The story created an immediate sensation in the city, filling the papers with 8-column banner headlines. "Rendering homage to the heroes of 47, Truman heals an old national wound forever," read one. "Friendship began today," said another. A cab driver told an American reporter to think that the most powerful man in the world would come and apologize. "He wanted to cry himself," the driver said. A prominent Mexican engineer was quoted, "100 years of misunderstanding and bitterness wiped out by one man in 1 minute. This is the best neighbor policy." President Truman, declared Mexican President Miguel Alemán, was the new champion of solidarity and understanding among the American republics. Asked by American reporters why he had gone to the monument, Truman said simply, "Brave men don't belong to any one country. I respect bravery wherever I see it." The 3-day whirlwind visit ended on March 6th, when the presidential party departed on the Sacred Cow before dawn. Moonlight reflected on the plane's wings as Truman looked out the window. Despite the hour and the chill morning air, 1,000 people had come to see him off. Less than a year before, in July 1946, as only a few were aware, Truman had asked Clark Clifford to prepare a comprehensive analysis of Soviet-American relations, the first of its kind. The project began at once, and though Clifford remained in charge and, with his editing, gave the finished effort much of its tone and emphasis, the real work, research and writing, was done by his assistant, George Elsey, who had suggested the project in the first place. He had felt, Elsey later explained, that Truman was judging Russia on too narrow a basis, his concerns limited too often to whether or not Russia was keeping its agreements. By the time Elsey was finished in September 1946, the report ran to nearly 100,000 words. It was immensely detailed and clearly influenced by Kennan's long telegram, but most of it had been drawn from interviews with or written reports from a dozen or more key people within the executive branch, including the State and War Departments. And in all, it was a far more alarming state paper than the long telegram, even though, as Elsey himself later said, most of the material had been previously called to Truman's attention by Burns, Forrestal, Harriman, Leahy, even Harry Hopkins, as early as April 1945. Titled American Relations with the Soviet Union, it began by stating that such relations posed the gravest problem facing the United States, and that Soviet leaders appeared to be on a course of aggrandizement designed to lead to eventual world domination by the USSR. The Soviet Union was consistently opposed to British-American efforts to achieve world peace agreements because the longer peace settlements were postponed, the longer Red Army troops could legally remain in enemy countries. Moreover, the Soviets were maintaining excessively large military forces in the satellite countries. The Soviets already dominated Finland, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. In Austria, only the presence of British, French, and American occupation troops prevented a Soviet takeover. Communist parties were growing in France and Italy. In a weak and divided China, the USSR was in a position to exert greater influence there than any other country. The Soviets were supplying the communist forces in China, while in Korea the Soviets had shown that they would consent to the unification of the country only if assured of a friendly government. Most ominous was Soviet military power. Generalissimo Stalin and his associates are supporting armed forces stronger than those of any potential combination of foreign powers, and they are developing as rapidly as possible a powerful and self-sufficient economy. They are seizing every opportunity to expand the area, directly or indirectly, under Soviet control, in order to provide additional protection for the vital areas of the Soviet Union. The menace was gathering. Russia was rapidly developing atomic weapons, guided missiles, materials for biological warfare, a strategic air force, submarines of great cruising range. The Soviet Union, the grim report continued, was also actively directing espionage and subversive movements in the United States. Since the language of military power was the only language the Russians understood, it was necessary that the United States maintain sufficient military strength to confine Soviet influence. Therefore, The United States, too, must be prepared to wage atomic and biological warfare. The mere fact of preparedness may be the only powerful deterrent to Soviet aggressive action, and in this sense the only sure guarantee of peace. In reviewing the situation in the Middle East, the report noted that the Soviets hoped for the withdrawal of troops from Greece to establish another of their friendly governments there. The Soviet desire for Turkey was a puppet state to serve as a springboard for the domination of the eastern Mediterranean. Finally, the report concluded that in addition to maintaining its military strength, the United States should support and assist all democratic countries which are in any way menaced or endangered by the USSR. George Kennan, when asked to look at a nearly completed draft, judged it excellent. Truman, who was up much of one night reading the final report, called Clifford at his home early the next morning to ask how many copies there were. 10, Clifford said. Truman wanted the other 9 put immediately under lock and key. The report was so hot, he told Clifford, that if it ever came out, its effect on his efforts to resolve the East-West conflict peacefully would be exceedingly unfortunate. How much effect it had on Truman is difficult to gauge. He never said. Clifford, when recounting the Truman years, would stress its great far-reaching influence, while Elsie would be far more modest. The impact of having it all drawn together may have had some influence on the president, Elsie would speculate. Again, I don't think one can, you never know, and neither the president nor anyone else is ever able to say exactly what all the influences are that help make up his mind. All the same, it was Clifford and Elsie who, after Truman's return from Mexico, put the finishing touches to the historic speech Truman would make before Congress concerning the situation in Greece, and much that was in the speech came directly from the report. At a cabinet meeting on March 7th, Truman's first day back from Mexico, Acheson said the complete disintegration of Greece was only weeks away. If we go in, we cannot be certain of success in the Middle East and Mediterranean. If we do not go in, there will be a collapse in these areas. There was also, of course, the possibility of military risk. Truman felt he faced a decision as difficult as any ever to confront a president. The money for Greece was only the beginning. It means the United States is going into European politics. The president's staff viewed the speech as potentially the most important of his career. A first draft had been prepared at the State Department, but Truman thought it too wordy and technical, more like an investment prospectus, as he later wrote. He also wanted the addition of a strong statement of American policy. Acheson made cuts and revisions, modified several passages, including a key sentence that essentially repeated what had been in the Clifford-Elsie report about helping countries in jeopardy from the Soviet Union, only here the Soviet Union was not to be mentioned by name. It is the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures, the line read in its original state. Acheson changed it to, I believe it must be the policy of the United States. To Clifford, it was time to take a stand against the Soviets, time for the opening gun in a campaign to awaken the American people. As he had urged the president to stand fast against John L. Lewis, so Clifford now urged a strong response to Stalin. George Kennan, on the other hand, thought the speech went too far, and in Paris Marshall looked it over with Chipolin, who was accompanying him to Moscow, and both felt there was too much rhetoric. When Bernard Baruch, who had no official position in the administration, let it be known that he too wished to have a say in the matter, Truman refused. If you take his advice, Truman said, then you have him on your hands for hours and hours, and it is his policy. I'm just not going to do it. We have a decision to make, and we'll make it. Hearing the story later from Clifford, David Lilienthal wrote in his diary that the president's comment interested me because it was so human. One of the few things a president can enjoy is to decide whom he will consult. Truman had Clifford and Elsie finish up the final draft as suited him. He was no Woodrow Wilson, who could sit down at a typewriter the night before addressing Congress at an historic juncture and tap out his own speech, but he knew what he wanted. I wanted no hedging. It had to be clear and free of hesitation or double talk. In answer to Marshall's concern about rhetoric, Marshall was told in the opinion of the executive branch, including the president, the Senate would not approve the new policy without emphasis on the communist threat. Probably that was correct. There is, such a thing as being too intellectual in your approach to a problem, Clark Clifford would say years later in an interview. The man who insists on seeing all sides of it often can't make up his mind where to take hold. Without any disparagement, that was never a problem for Mr. Truman. He wanted all the facts he could get before he made up his mind. But if he could get only 80% of the facts in the time available, he didn't let the missing 20% tie him up in indecision. He believed that even a wrong decision was better than no decision at all. And when he made up his mind, that was it. We'd been through the greatest war in which the world had ever been involved. This is 1947. The war ended in August of 1945. There was every reason for Harry Truman to say, "This is not for us." And he kept worrying about it, thinking about it. I remember thinking there was really nothing to impede the Soviet forces, if they chose to, from just marching straight west of the English Channel. And yet he decided that it had to be done. Harry Truman looks at this, and he just steps up to it. The speech setting forth what became known as the Truman Doctrine was delivered in the House chamber before a joint session of Congress on Wednesday, March 12, 1947, beginning a few minutes past 1 o'clock. It was a straightforward declarative statement lasting 18 minutes. Greece was in desperate need. The situation was urgent. The existing Greek government was not perfect, and the government of the United States, no less than ever, condemned extremist measures of the right or left. Though Turkey, unlike Greece, had been spared the destruction and suffering of the war, Turkey also needed American support. One of the primary objectives of American policy, Truman said, was the creation of conditions in which we and other nations will be able to work out a way of life free of coercion. This had been a fundamental issue in the war with Germany and Japan, countries that had tried to impose their will and their way of life upon other countries. Dressed in a dark suit and dark tie, he read from an open notebook slowly and with great force. His audience listened in silence. Hardly anyone moved. In the front row, John Snyder had his head bowed. Beside him, the perfectly tailored Atchison sat as stiff and straight as if at a memorial service, hands folded in his lap. Further along in the same row, Senator Taft fiddled with his glasses, rubbed his face, then yawned. On the dais behind Truman, Speaker Martin and Senator Vandenberg were following the speech line by line in printed copies. At the present moment in world history, nearly every nation must choose between alternative ways of life. The choice is too often not a free one. One way of life is based upon the will of the majority and is distinguished by free institutions, representative government, free elections, guarantees of individual liberty, freedom of speech and religion, and freedom from political oppression. The second way of life is based upon the will of a minority, forcibly imposed upon the majority. It relies upon terror and oppression, a controlled press and radio, fixed elections, and the suppression of personal freedoms. I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. I believe that we must assist free peoples to work out their own destinies in their own way. I believe that our help should be primarily through economic and financial aid, which is essential to economic stability and orderly political processes. Should we fail to aid Greece and Turkey in this fateful hour, the effect will be far-reaching to the West as well as to the East. We must take immediate and resolute action. To many who were listening there in the chamber and over the radio, it seemed an odd, ironic time for a crisis. The United States was the richest, strongest country in the world and prospering as few could have ever imagined. Production was up, incomes were up. There were few strikes. There was no more waiting for new automobiles, no meat shortages any longer. White shirts, nylon stockings, fishing tackle, and golf balls were back on store shelves. Because of the GI Bill, more than 4 million veterans were attending college, as most never could have in other times. Yet the speech seemed disturbingly like a call to arms. "Well, I told my wife to dust off my uniform," an ex-soldier enrolled at the University of Oklahoma remarked to a reporter. The cost of winning the war had been $341 billion. Now, $400 million was needed for Greece and Turkey. "This is a serious course upon which we embark," Truman said at the finish, and the look on his face was serious indeed. "I would not recommend it except that the alternative is much more serious. If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world, and we shall surely endanger the welfare of this nation." The entire room rose in applause, but as Atchison later wrote, it was more as a tribute to a brave man than a unanimous acceptance of his policy. Truman, holding the closed notebook with the speech in front of his chest with both hands, nodded to the applause left and right several times, but he never smiled. Editorial reaction was overwhelmingly supportive. The New York Times compared the speech to the Monroe Doctrine. To the editors of Time and Life, it was a great clearing of the air at long last. Like a bolt of lightning, said Life, the speech cut through the confused international atmosphere. The president, said Collier's, had hit the popularity jackpot. But support was often expressed with troubling reservations. Are we to shoulder the mantle of 19th-century British imperialism? Asked the San Francisco Examiner, and some of the liberal press was outraged. PM charged Truman with scrapping Roosevelt's whole policy on Russia. Most important was the objection of Walter Lippmann, who, though favoring aid to Greece, disapproved of the president's tone. A vague global policy which sounds like the tocsin of an ideological crusade has no limits, Lippmann warned. It cannot be controlled. Its effects cannot be predicted. That the speech was of immense importance, signaling a turning point, no one seems to have doubted. If words could shape the future of nations, wrote Newsweek, these unquestionably would. They had clearly put America into power politics to stay. On Capitol Hill, Senator Vandenberg was quick to stress that he did not consider Greek-Turkish aid as a universal pattern, but something only to fit a given circumstance. Atchison, too, told the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that the bill was not intended to establish a pattern for the future. The United States, he stressed, would, of course, act according to the circumstances of each specific case. Objections in Congress came from liberals and conservatives alike. Senator Pepper was sure such a policy would destroy all hope of reconciliation with Russia. Senators Byrd and McKellar were opposed chiefly because of cost. I guess the do-gooders won't feel right until they have us all broke, said Republican Representative Harold Knudsen of Minnesota. Truman, within minutes after delivering the speech, had been on his way to the airport and another flight to Florida. The president, explained Wallace Graham, had been going pretty hard lately and needed a rest. In plain truth, the president was exhausted. Writing to Margaret from Key West, he said no one had any idea how worn to a frazzle he was by this terrible decision. But the police state of communism was no different from the police state of the Nazis, he told her. He had known that since Potsdam. In the time between Truman's dramatic appearance before Congress and the final vote on aid to Greece and Turkey, the fight in the Senate over the Lilienthal nomination grew intense and abusive. The opposition was nearly all Republican. Senator John Bricker of Ohio, who had been Dewey's running mate in 1944, warned that it might be the last chance ever to get the Atomic Energy Commission out of the hands of leftists. Capehart of Indiana said that especially now, in view of the situation in Greece and Turkey, control of atomic energy ought to be returned to the Army, an idea that appealed also to Senator Taft. Brewster of Maine, who had once served on the Truman Committee, claimed Lilienthal's indifference to communism made him no less a threat than if he were an outright party member. If Mr. L is a communist, so am I, Truman wrote privately. He would carry the fight to the end, Truman vowed. It is a matter of principle, and we cannot let the peanut politicians ruin a good man. Taft, Truman thought, was succeeding only in making himself look like a fool. A few Republicans, Noland of California, Saltonstall of Massachusetts, Aiken of Vermont, declared support for the nominee. But the decisive moment came when Vandenberg spoke to a tense session on the afternoon of April 3rd, giving what many thought was his finest speech ever. David Lilienthal, Vandenberg said, was no part of a communist by any stretch of the imagination. When Vandenberg called for Lilienthal's confirmation, the galleries roared with applause. There was a test vote on an amendment. Lilienthal was with Truman at the White House when Charlie Ross put his head in at the door to report the result. They had won by a margin of 14 votes, more than anyone had thought possible. Truman and Lilienthal shook hands. Atomic energy was the most important thing there is, Truman remarked, looking subdued and thoughtful. You must make a blessing of it, or, he said, pointing to a large globe in the corner, we'll blow that all to smithereens. The final formal vote in the Senate came on April 9th, when a total of 20 Republicans defied Taft to support Lilienthal. Of the Southern Democrats, Only 4 besides McKellar voted against him. The nomination was confirmed by 50 to 31. It was Truman's first test of strength with the new Congress, and a sweet victory. Yet the issue of loyalty, the issue of who was or who was not, in Taft's phrase, soft on communism, was by no means ended. The Republican leadership, having made communism a theme with such success in the fall elections, would keep up the demand for investigations. And Truman, to head off such attacks from conservatives in both parties, had by this time accepted the view of a special commission and of Attorney General Clark and the director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, that a program of loyalty reviews was necessary. The whole concept troubled him. In notes he made of a conversation with the president in May 1947, Clark Clifford wrote, "He is very strongly anti-FBI, wants to be sure to hold FBI down, afraid of Gestapo." Further, too much was being made of the communist bugaboo, Truman thought, and said so in a letter to a former Pennsylvania governor named George Earle. The country was perfectly safe so far as communism is concerned. We have far too many sane people. The political pressures bore heavily, however. Attorney General Clark, conceding that the number of disloyal employees in the government was probably small, argued that even one such person posed a serious threat. J. Edgar Hoover wanted authority to remove anyone from public service whose views were politically suspect. Such people, Hoover warned, might well influence foreign policy in a way that could favor the foreign country of their ideological choice. Like many Republicans on Capitol Hill, Hoover saw the State Department as the core of the problem. In his first speech as the new Speaker of the House, Joe Martin had declared there was no room in the government of the United States for any who prefer the communistic system. Accusations that the New Deal had been riddled with communists were made repeatedly and widely believed, however unfounded. The long tenure of the Democratic Party had poisoned the air we Republicans breathed, remembered Martin much later. Fear of communist penetration of the government was an ugly new phenomenon. Suspicion of the State Department was rife. We were disturbed and bewildered by the new power of the Soviet Union. Truman worried particularly about the House Committee on Un-American Activities and the extremes it might go to under its vile-tempered and to Truman contemptible Republican chairman, Representative J. Parnell Thomas of New Jersey. By acting first on the loyalty issue, Truman hoped to head Thomas off. Also, importantly, he wanted no accusations of administration softness on communism at home, just as he was calling for a new hard approach to communism abroad. On Friday, March 21, 1947, 9 days after his address to Congress, Truman issued Executive Order No. 9835, establishing an elaborate federal employees' loyalty and security program, and he did so with misgivings. Roosevelt, in 1942, had empowered the civil service to disqualify anyone from government employment where there was a reasonable doubt of loyalty, and by executive order, Roosevelt later assigned the Justice Department and FBI to check on the loyalty of government workers. But that had been during the war. Until now, no such step had ever been taken in peacetime. His purpose, Truman later wrote, was twofold: to guard against disloyal employees in the government workforce, and to protect innocent government workers from unfounded accusations. To show that he had no intention of playing politics with the program, he put a conservative Republican, a prominent Washington lawyer named Seth Richardson, in charge of its review board. All federal employees were to be subject to loyalty investigations, whatever their jobs. FBI files and the files of the House Un-American Activities Committee would be called into use. Anyone found to be disloyal could no longer hold a government job. Dismissal could be based merely on reasonable grounds for belief that the person is disloyal. Yet the term disloyal was never defined. Moreover, those accused would be unable to confront those making charges against them, or even to know who they were or what exactly the charges were. In addition, the Attorney General was authorized to draw up a list of subversive organizations. To David Lilienthal, who well knew the torment that self-proclaimed communist hunters could bring down on a loyal government employee, the whole program looked ominous. Anyone serving in the government could be at the mercy of almost any malevolent accuser. In practical effect, Lilienthal wrote in his diary, the usual rule that men are presumed innocent until proved guilty is in reverse. Yet Lilienthal, too, conceded that something of the sort probably had to be initiated, and so staunch an upholder of liberal principle as the New York Post called the program a logical answer to subversion. At his next press conference, Truman was asked little or nothing about it. Of more interest was his letter to the former Pennsylvania governor. Was he truly so unconcerned about the communist bugaboo? "I am not worried about the Communist Party taking over the government of the United States," Truman replied, "but I am against a person whose loyalty is not to the government of the United States holding a government job." At the time, it seemed all the answer anyone could ask for. In another few months, the FBI would begin running name checks on every one of the 2 million people on the federal payrolls, a monstrous, costly task. Over 4 years, by 1951, 3 million employees would be investigated and cleared by the Civil Service Commission, and another 14,000 by the FBI. Several thousand would resign, but only 212 would be dismissed as being of questionable loyalty. None would be indicted, and no evidence of espionage would be found. Clark Clifford would say sadly years later that the whole program had been a response to the temper of the times, and that he did not see how Truman could have done otherwise. But in an interview with the journalist Carl Bernstein, Clifford was considerably more blunt. "It was a political problem," Clifford told Bernstein. "Truman was going to run in 48, and that was it. My own feeling was there was not a serious problem. I felt the whole thing was being manufactured. We never had a serious discussion about a real loyalty problem. The president didn't attach fundamental importance to the so-called communist scare. He thought it was a lot of baloney. But political pressures were such that he had to recognize it. There was no substantive problem. We did not believe there was a real problem. A problem was being manufactured." To Bernstein, this was a particularly chilling revelation, since his own parents had been among victims of the loyalty program. And politically, the effect of Executive Order No. 9835 was indeed pronounced, for the moment at least, as Times Capitol Hill correspondent Frank McNaughton described in a confidential report to his editors. "The Republicans are now taking Truman seriously. His order to root out subversives from government employment hit a solid note with Congress and further pulled the rug from under his political detractors. The charge of communists in government and nothing being done about it, a favorite theme of the reactionaries, simply will not stick any longer. The Republicans are beginning to realize Truman is no pushover." That Truman's concern over J. Edgar Hoover continued to trouble him, there is no question. "If I can prevent it, there'll be no NKVD, Soviet secret police, or Gestapo in this country," he wrote privately to Bess. "Edgar Hoover's organization would make a good start toward a citizen spy system. Not for me." Writing in his memoirs years later, well after the pernicious influence of the loyalty program had become all too clear, Truman could say only in lame defense that it had started out to be as fair as possible under the climate of opinion that then existed. In private conversation with friends, however, he would concede it had been a bad mistake. "Yes, it was terrible," he said. On April 22, 1947, the Senate overwhelmingly approved aid to Greece and Turkey by a vote of 67 to 23. On May 9th, the House, like the Senate, passed the bill by a margin of nearly 3-1, 287 to 107. On May 22nd, while visiting his mother in Grandview, Truman sat at the Mission Oak table in her small parlor and signed the $400 million aid package. The Truman Doctrine had been sanctioned. Though it seemed so at the time and would often be so presented in later accounts, the Truman Doctrine was not an abrupt, dramatic turn in American policy, but a declaration of principle. It was a continuation of a policy that had been evolving since Potsdam, its essence to be found in Kennan's long telegram and in the more emphatic Clifford-Elsie report. It could even be said that it began with Averell Harriman's first meeting with Truman before Potsdam. But, be that as it may, the Truman Doctrine would guide the foreign policy of the United States for another generation and more, for better or worse, despite any of the assurances by Acheson and Vandenberg that this was not the intent. 3. It could not have been a more exciting or important time, Clark Clifford would say, recalling events of 1947 and 48. "I think it's one of the proudest moments in American history. What happened during that period was that Harry Truman and the United States saved the free world." Others felt the same. A young economic advisor at the State Department, Paul Nitze, would reflect after a long, eventful career in public service that nothing had given him such satisfaction as the work accomplished then. Dean Acheson, speaking for all of them, would write that they had been present at the creation. Their exhilaration derived in part from the tremendous urgency of the moment. Events moved rapidly. There was much to be done and little time to do it, Truman would remember. Plans had to be conceived and clarified with minimum delay, imagination applied, decisions reached, and always with the realities and imponderables of politics weighed in the balance. The pressure was unrelenting. "You don't sit down and take time to think through and debate ad nauseum all the points," George Elsey would say in response to latter-day critics. "You don't have time. Later somebody can sit around for days and weeks and figure out how things might have been done differently. This is all very well and very interesting and quite irrelevant." With the stress of deadlines and long hours, emotions often ran high. The struggle to draw up a preliminary report for what would become the Marshall Plan was for George Kennan an intellectual agony greater than any he had known. So intense did a debate with his associates become one harried night at the State Department that Kennan had to leave the room and go outside, where he walked, weeping, around the entire building. What they were attempting was, besides, different from what had gone before. They were pioneering, the state of the world being, as Acheson said, wholly novel within the experience of those who had to deal with it. Of great importance also to everyone's morale in the spring of 1947 was the changed outlook of the president, a subject which by now had drawn much attention. Dozens of articles appeared describing the new Truman, and for the reason that the change was truly striking. He was in top spirits, reported the New York Times. The whole political picture has changed in Washington. The president was very different now, calm and forceful, wrote Alden Hatch in Liberty magazine. The recent change in Harry Truman has been variously described to new advisers, a difference of political climate or a change in his nature. The fact is that it is not change, but growth. His voice, his whole manner had a new authority, said Collier's. He was no longer Roosevelt's stand-in. Noting that Truman's public approval rating was up sharply to 60%, Time lauded his new sense of the dignity of his office. The president said Time had acquired a new confidence and a new formula, be natural. On an afternoon in mid-April, speaking extemporaneously to several hundred members of the American Society of Newspaper Editors who crowded into his office, Truman was as impressive as he had ever been before such a group. Relaxed, sure of himself, convincing in a way that seemed to take many of them by surprise. The Truman Doctrine, he said, was no sudden turn in policy, and he traced the history of relations with Russia from the time of his first meeting with Molotov there in the same room 2 years before. He was sure a solution to the problems with the Soviets would be found, and that a long era of peace was in store. "I believe that as sincerely as I am standing here. It was essential to stand for what we believe is right, hard as the Russians were to negotiate with. They deal from day to day, and what's done yesterday has no bearing on what's done today or tomorrow. We have to make up our mind what our policy is." He had just been talking with a pilot who had flown around the world in 68 hours, he told them. "We must catch up morally and internationally with the machine age. We must catch up with it in such a way as to create peace in the world, or it will destroy us and everybody else. And that we don't dare contemplate." To his staff, it was an inspiring performance, a long way from the fumbling press conferences of the previous year. The morale of the staff had never been higher. Truman spoke of them proudly and affectionately as his team. They were devoted to him, and increasingly, as time went on, the better they knew him, quite as much as those who had served with him in the army. They liked him as a man, greatly respected him as a leader, admiring his courage, decisiveness, and fundamental honesty. The president they worked for, the Harry Truman they saw day to day, bore almost no resemblance to the stereotype Harry Truman, the cocky, profane, feisty little guy. Rather, it was a quiet-spoken, even-tempered, and uncommonly kind-hearted person, whose respect for the office he held enlarged their appreciation not only of him, but of their own responsibilities. He was, as I'm sure you know, an extremely thoughtful, courteous, considerate man, George Elsey would tell an interviewer years later. He was a pleasure to work for, very kindly, never too busy to think about members of his staff. He had a tremendous veneration and respect for the institution of the presidency. He demanded at all times respect for the President of the United States. William J. Hopkins, an executive clerk who would serve nearly 40 years in the White House, said later of Truman that no president in his experience had set a comparable tone. Truman, Hopkins emphasized, liked people, he trusted people, and in turn he engendered a feeling of unqualified loyalty and devotion among his staff. A measure of the Truman manner and outlook was the way he conducted his regular morning meeting with the staff, one of the most important events of their day for the information and sense of direction provided, but also for its overall atmosphere. The staff numbered 13, 2 more than in Roosevelt's time, and Truman was his own chief of staff. The meetings were informal, yet orderly and businesslike. Truman would open the door of his office on the dot of 9 o'clock, and one by one they would file in and take their seats. He was seated at his desk. The staff assembled in a semicircle around his desk, and much of the day's business was gone over, remembered Hopkins. He usually started with Matt Connolly, who would bring up matters relating to presidential appointments, what was on the agenda for the day, and upcoming appointments. He would also bring to the president's attention requests for speeches throughout the country, getting the president's reactions, and, in some cases, commitments. The president would then turn to Charlie Ross and see what problems might arise during the day in his relations with the press. Many matters were discussed in terms of how to answer press questions and deal with certain problems. Dr. Steelman, of course, was there, and Clark Clifford, and they brought up matters in their areas of responsibility. It was an opportunity to listen to the president's philosophy and get his directions for the day. President Truman was a prodigious reader, and each night he would carry home a portfolio, often 6 or 8 inches thick. The next morning he would have gone through all that material and taken such action as was needed. He had a desk folder labeled for each of his staff members, and at this staff meeting he would pass out to them documents in their area of responsibility, or on which he wished their advice or recommendations, or on matters he wanted raised with the various departments and agencies. In this way, each staff member knew basically what the others were doing, knew to whom the president had given which responsibility, whether it was to respond to a certain request or to follow through on the preparation of an executive order or a speech or things of that nature. Truman was as tidy about his desk as he was about his clothes. The flow of paper was probably the best I have experienced, remembered Hopkins, whose job as executive clerk was to bring to the president and keep track of the immense range of documents requiring his attention or signature. Enrolled bills, executive orders, proclamations, executive clemency cases, treaties, departmental directives, nominations for federal office, commissions, messages to Congress, in addition to gleanings from the incoming mail, which were routinely delivered to Truman's desk twice a day, in the morning and again after lunch. Hopkins, who was himself extremely punctual, also noted admiringly of Truman, when he went to lunch, if he left word that he would return at 2 p.m., he was back without fail, not at 2:05, not at 1:15, but at 2 p.m. The longer he was in office, the more conscious Truman seemed of time. On his desk now he had a total of 4 clocks, as well as 2 others elsewhere in the room, and his own wristwatch. Ross, Clifford, Elsie could each tell his own stories of Truman's exceptional diligence, the long hours he kept, working as hard or harder than any of them. Lots of times I would be down there at the White House in the evening, Clifford would remember, and he'd be sitting upstairs in the Oval Room upstairs with an old-fashioned green eyeshade on, like bookkeepers wear, and he'd be sitting there reading all this material, and we would talk together, and he took it very, very seriously, and the strain of the job was enormous. He spent virtually every waking moment working at being president, said Charles Murphy, a new man on the staff in 1947 who was Clifford's assistant. To convey the kind of sustained effort the presidency demanded, Murphy would compare it to cramming for and taking an examination every day, year after year, with never a let-up. Murphy particularly admired Truman's gift for simplification. Not only could he simplify complex matters, he could also keep simple matters simple. The staff was continuously amazed by the president's knowledge of the country, acquired from years of travel by automobile and from the territory covered at the time of the Truman Committee investigations. Charlie Ross claimed that Truman could look out of his plane at almost any point and name the exact region he was flying over. They liked his sense of humor. An economist, he told them, is a man who wears a watch chain with a Phi Beta Kappa key at one end and no watch at the other. And all of them, it seems, admired his sense of history, which they saw as one of his greatest strengths. "If a man is acquainted with what other people have experienced at this desk," Truman would say, sitting in the Oval Office, "it will be easier for him to go through a similar experience. It is ignorance that causes most mistakes. The man who sits here ought to know his American history at least." When Truman talked of presidents past, Jackson, Polk, Lincoln, it was as if he had known them personally. If ever there was a clean break from all that had gone before, he would say, the result would be chaos. Once that spring at lunch on the Williamsburg, during a brief cruise down the Potomac, Truman and Bill Hassett, the correspondence secretary, began talking about the Civil War. As the others at the table listened, the conversation ranged over several battles and the abilities and flaws of various Union and Confederate generals. Truman, as often before, impressing everyone with how much he had read and remembered. "He would like to have been a history teacher," Truman said. "Rather teach it than make it?" Clifford asked. "Yes, I think so," Truman replied. "It would be not nearly so much trouble." Clifford had become particularly important to Truman, in much the way Harry Hopkins had been to Roosevelt, and it was vital, they both knew, that Clifford understand Truman and what he was trying to accomplish in the long run. He did not want an administration like Roosevelt's, Truman said. Too many of those around Roosevelt had been crackpots, he thought. "I want to keep my feet on the ground. Don't feel comfortable unless I know where I'm going. I don't want any experiments. The American people have been through a lot of experiments, and they want a rest from experiments." He disliked the terms progressive and liberal. What he wanted was a forward-looking program. That was it, a forward-looking program. Perhaps more than Truman knew, they all appreciated the respect he showed them. Charles Murphy, a shy man who spoke only when spoken to, would later remark, "In many ways President Truman really was as tough as a boot, but with his personal staff he was extremely gentle, and his staff returned his kindness with an extraordinary amount of hard work, voluntary overtime, and wholehearted, single-minded devotion." By later presidential standards, the staff was small, and unlike the White House staffs of some later presidencies, those serving Truman made no policy decisions. As George Elsey would remember, no one on Truman's staff would have dreamed of making policy or making decisions on fundamental economic or political issues, or any other kind of issue. "It just has to be said over and over again," Elsey would comment in an interview years later. "There was no vast foreign policy machinery at the White House. There was no vast machinery on any subject at the White House. And no one trying to make their reputations by undercutting, by slitting the throat of a Secretary of State, by trying to prove to the President that they're smarter and more brilliant and their ideas are better than the Secretary of State. None of that existed. Had anybody at the White House tried to behave that way, he would have been out of there in 30 seconds flat." The loyalty of those around Truman was total and would never falter. In years to come, not one member of the Truman White House would ever speak or write scathingly of him or belittle him in any fashion. There would be no vindictive inside books or articles written about this president by those who worked closest to him. They all thought the world of Harry Truman then and for the rest of their lives, and would welcome the chance to say so. For Charlie Ross, the senior member of the staff and the one who had known Truman the longest, longer than anyone in the administration, serving with him for all the strain of the job and the drastic cut in income it had meant was the privilege of a lifetime, as Ross would privately write to Truman later that year on Christmas Day 1947. "Dear Mr. President, there is nothing in life, I think, more satisfying than friendship, and to have yours is a rare satisfaction indeed. 2.5 years ago you put my feet to the fire, as you said. I am happy that you did. They have been the most rewarding years of my life. Your faith in me, the generous manifestations of your friendship, the association with the fine people around you, your good team, all these have been an inspiration. But the greatest inspiration, Mr. President, has been the character of you. You as President, you as a human being. Perhaps I can say best what is in my heart by telling you that my admiration for you and my deep affection have grown steadily since the day you honored me with your trust." Truman had rarely received a letter that meant so much to him. To Dean Acheson, it was Truman's priceless gift of vitality, the life force itself, that was his strongest, most inspiriting quality, and always in the darkest, most difficult of times. The President's supply of vitality and good spirits seemed inexhaustible, wrote Acheson, who, to make his point, would quote from Shakespeare's Henry V, the lines delivered the night before Agincourt. Every wretch pining and pale before, beholding him, plucks comfort from his looks. His liberal eye doth give to every one a little touch of Harry in the night. It was this little touch of Harry that kept all of us going, Acheson would remember. In addition, there was the example of General Marshall, who lent everyone confidence and raised morale not just at the State Department, but throughout the administration. "Gentlemen, enlisted men may be entitled to morale problems, but officers are not," Marshall would tell those who served with him. "I expect all officers in this department to take care of their own morale. No one is taking care of my morale." Morale improved steadily. As Acheson would stress, he and others at the State Department felt they were being led by two men of rare quality, the President and the Secretary. On Capitol Hill, in his speech in support of the Truman Doctrine, Sam Rayburn had said the nation again has leaders asking for certain action, and his emphasis on leaders in the plural did not go unnoticed. Marshall's entire personality inspired confidence, Truman would write. It was Truman's long-held conviction that men make history. Clearly, in the spring of 1947, with the Marshall Plan following on the heels of the Truman Doctrine, things of immense importance happened principally because a relative handful of men made them happen, almost entirely on their own, against great odds, and in amazingly little time. On Saturday, April 26, 1947, Secretary Marshall returned to Washington from Moscow, gravely worried and upset. His sessions with Molotov had been an ordeal, dragging on day after day with little purpose, Molotov acting all the while as if time and the frustrations of the Western Allies were of no concern. Marshall wanted an agreement on the future of Germany. Hoping he might do better dealing directly with Stalin, he made a courtesy call at the Kremlin. But Stalin had asked what difference it made if there was no agreement. "We may agree the next time, or if not then, the time after," Stalin said as he idly doodled wolves' heads with a red pencil. Stalin's indifference made a profound impression on Marshall. The Soviets, it seemed, were quite content to see uncertainty and chaos prevail in Europe. It served their purposes to let matters drift. Particularly, they had no wish for a return of order and stability in Germany, let alone a revived prosperity there. Marshall had thought the Russians could be negotiated with, but at Moscow he decided he had been mistaken. Before leaving Washington, he received an urgent memo from Undersecretary for Economic Affairs, Will Clayton, warning that conditions in Western Europe were more serious than generally understood. During stops in Paris and Berlin while going to and from Moscow, Marshall was stunned by what he saw and heard. On the plane back to Washington, he talked of little else but what could be done to save Western Europe. Time was of the essence, Marshall stressed to Truman. "The patient is sinking while the doctors deliberate," he told the nation in a radio broadcast April 28th. The next day, Marshall summoned George Kennan, instructed him to assemble a special staff immediately and to report without delay on what should be done to save Europe. As Kennan later recalled, Marshall had only one piece of advice: avoid trivia. The idea of economic aid to Europe had been on Truman's mind for some while. 2 years past, in one of their earliest conversations in the Oval Office, Henry Stimson had pointedly told him that an economically strong, productive Germany was essential to the future stability of Europe, a concept Truman readily accepted. In his own State of the Union message in January, Truman had struck the theme of sharing American bounty with war-stricken peoples as a means of spreading the faith of freedom and democracy. And on March 6th, even before the announcement of the Truman Doctrine, he had said in a speech at Baylor University, "We are the giant of the economic world. Whether we like it or not, the future pattern of economic relations depends upon us." Early in May, Truman sent Dean Acheson to fill in for him with a foreign policy speech in a remote little town in Mississippi called Cleveland at the Delta State Teachers College. Kennan and his special staff had as yet to make their report, but Truman had already made up his mind from what Marshall had said after returning from Moscow that Europe had to be rescued, and quickly. The speech Acheson made was the alarm bell that Truman wanted sounded. The stricken countries of Europe needed everything and could afford to buy nothing. Financial help was imperative, but, as Acheson stressed, the objective was not relief. It was the revival of industry, agriculture, and trade. The margin of survival was so close in Europe that the savage winter just past had been nearly disastrous. Massive funding was needed if Europe was to be saved. "It is necessary if we are to preserve our own freedoms, necessary for our national security, and it is our duty and privilege as human beings." What was Europe now? Winston Churchill asked rhetorically in a speech in London on May 14th. It is a rubble heap, a charnel house, a breeding ground of pestilence and hate. The Kennan Report, certain aspects of the European recovery problem from the United States standpoint, was delivered to Marshall on May 25th. American response to world problems must be more than defensive reaction to communist pressure, it said. An American aid effort in Europe should be directed not to combating communism as such, but to the restoration of the economic health and vigor of European society. 2 days later, Undersecretary Clayton, having just completed an inspection tour of Europe, sent another urgent memo. The situation was worse than anyone supposed. Millions of people were slowly starving. A collapse in Europe would mean revolution and a tailspin for the American economy. Long sessions followed at the State Department and around the President's desk. With Truman's approval, Marshall decided to make a speech at Harvard, where he had been invited to receive an honorary degree at commencement exercises on Thursday, June 5th, an idea Atchison opposed for the reason that no one ever listened to commencement speeches. When the moment came, at the podium in the sunshine of Harvard Yard, before an audience of 7,000, Marshall read his remarks in a soft voice, his head down, as though he did not care especially if they were listening. The speech had been written by Bolin in about 2 days, drawing heavily on the Kennan Report. Whether Truman saw a copy in advance is not recorded, but given Marshall's extreme care to keep the President always informed, it is almost certain they discussed the matter. As Marshall wanted, there were no oratorical flourishes, nor was there any strident anti-communist language. Our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. Its purpose should be the revival of a working economy in the world so as to permit the emergence of political and social conditions in which free institutions can exist. 2 ideas were new and distinguishing. He was calling on the Europeans to get together and, with American help, work out their own programs. And by inference, he was leaving the door open to the Soviets and their satellite countries to take part. It would be neither fitting nor efficacious for this government to undertake to draw up unilaterally a program designed to place Europe on its feet economically. That is the business of the Europeans. The initiative, I think, must come from Europe. The role of this country should consist of friendly aid in the drafting of a European program and of later support for such a program so far as it is practical for us to do so. The program should be a joint one, agreed to by a number, if not all, European nations. Then, speaking directly to the American people, Marshall said it was virtually impossible by merely reading articles or looking at photographs to grasp the real significance of conditions in Europe. And yet the whole world's future hangs on proper judgment, hangs on the realization by the American people of what can best be done or what must be done. The speech caught nearly everyone by surprise, in Europe no less than in the United States. "We grabbed the lifeline with both hands," said British Foreign Minister Ernest Bevin, who was the first to see the momentous import of what Marshall had said. At a staff meeting the next day at the State Department, Marshall asked Kennan and Bolin whether the Soviet Union would accept an invitation to join the plan. They did not think so, said the 2 Russian experts, but advised him to play it straight with the Soviets and exclude no one. It was a calculated gamble, since Congress was not likely to support any aid program that included the Soviets, but a gamble Marshall was willing to take and that Truman backed. As Kennan later wrote, authorship of the plan was variously claimed and imputed, and he, Bolin, Atchison, and Clayton were only some of a dozen or more who had had a hand in its creation. Marshall would praise Kennan's work in particular. Clark Clifford would stress the part Atchison played. But Clifford himself had been involved at every stage. In fairness, it might have been called the Atchison-Clifford-Marshall Plan. Truman would always give Marshall full credit. When Clifford urged that it be called the Truman Plan, Truman dismissed the idea at once. It would be called the Marshall Plan, he said. More than once in his presidency, Truman would be remembered saying it was remarkable how much could be accomplished if you didn't care who received the credit. But in this case he insisted that Marshall be the one most honored because Marshall deserved no less. He also commented realistically, "Anything that is sent up to the Senate and House with my name on it will quiver a couple of times and die." But Truman was the president, and so the Marshall Plan would be his, inevitably, be it a success or failure. His confidence in Marshall could have misfired and brought embarrassment and trouble to the administration. A Marshall Plan that failed would assuredly have become a Truman Plan. One member of the policy planning staff, Lewis J. Hall, said later of Truman that he had in Marshall a soldier of the highest prestige, in Atchison a man of both commanding intellect and fierce personal integrity who at critical moments like Truman was willing to risk his own career rather than abstain from doing what he conceived to be right. And in Kennan, a man of Shakespearean insight and vision. Among Truman's own strongest qualities was his ability to appreciate these men and to support them as they supported him. The Republicans were determined to cut taxes and expenditures, and already since the war $3 billion had been spent in foreign relief. In a single grant in 1946, the United States had loaned Britain $3.25 billion, and now it seemed to little purpose. By Will Clayton's calculations, the Europeans would need $6 or $7 billion in the coming 2 or 3 years. When Arthur Vandenberg read this in the New York Times in an article by James Reston, he telephoned Reston to say that surely he was misinformed. Congress, Vandenberg said, would never approve such sums, not to save anybody. As all who were involved with the project appreciated, an enormous effort was called for if the people and the Congress were to be convinced, and the appeal would have to be to both American altruism and American self-interest, the same motivating factors that had propelled the idea from the beginning. When Truman called Sam Rayburn to the White House to brief him on what the cost might be, Rayburn was as incredulous as Vandenberg and insisted it would bankrupt the country. Truman said there was no way of telling how many hundreds of thousands of people would starve to death in Europe, and that this must not happen, not if it could be prevented. He was also sure, Truman said, that if Europe went down the drain in a depression, the United States would follow. And you and I both lived through one depression, and we don't want to have to live through another one, do we, Sam? With Britain's Bevan taking the lead, a hasty conference was organized in Paris, to which the Soviets sent a sizable delegation headed by Molotov. The provisional and largely communist-dominated government of Czechoslovakia had already indicated that it wished to be included in the program. Communist leaders in Poland and Romania had shown interest. But 5 days into the conference, after being handed a telegram from Moscow, Molotov stood up from the table and abruptly announced that the Soviet Union was withdrawing. The Marshall Plan, he said, was nothing but a vicious American scheme for using dollars to buy its way into the affairs of Europe. Stalin had found unacceptable 2 particular American conditions: a pooling of resources that would include Soviet funds to rebuild parts of Western and Central Europe, and an open accounting of how American money was being spent. Eventually, 17 nations would take part, but under Soviet pressure, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Romania, and the other satellite countries of Eastern Europe did not. By refusing to take part in the Marshall Plan, Stalin had virtually guaranteed its success. Sooner or later, congressional support was bound to follow now, whatever the volume of grumbling on the Hill. Officially, it was called the European Recovery Program, or ERP, and the total sum requested was colossal indeed, $17 billion. Bolin, Kennan, and others from the State Department were assigned to sell it to Congress, while a draft of specific plans was being drawn up by Paul Nitze, the young economic advisor. Arthur Vandenberg again played a vital role in the Senate. Marshall himself would eventually make a cross-country speaking tour to convince business and civic groups, and with great effect, though the daring, wholehearted plan he proposed was not about to happen overnight. Nor was there a let-up in the pressure of events overall. That June, to curb the powers of big labor, the Republican-controlled Congress passed by large majorities the Taft-Hartley Act, which outlawed the closed shop, made unions liable for breach of contract, prohibited political contributions from unions, required them to make financial reports, required their leaders to take a non-communist oath. On Friday, June 20th, after 2 weeks of deliberation, Truman vetoed the bill, calling it an attack on the working man, though all the cabinet but Schwellenbach and Hannigan had urged him to sign it, including John Snyder, his closest friend in the cabinet. Clark Clifford, however, saw it as another chance to take a stand. Clifford wanted Truman to move more to the left on most matters, to strike for new high ground, as he later said. Most of the cabinet and the congressional leaders were urging Mr. Truman to go slow, to veer a little closer to the conservative line, Clifford remembered. They held the image of Bob Taft before him like a boogeyman. Thousands of letters pouring into the White House also favored the veto, and Truman, who genuinely believed it was a bad bill, knew a veto would go far to bring labor back into Democratic politics. As his daughter Margaret would one day write, remembering the Taft-Hartley veto, While he was responding to his presidential conscience, my father did not by any means stop being a politician. The two are by no means incompatible. It was only a matter of days until Congress voted to override the veto, and in the House more Democrats voted against the president than with him. On July 25th, Congress passed Truman's sweeping National Security Act, legislation he had sent to the Hill in February, and that would mean mammoth change for the whole structure of power in Washington. Its primary purpose was to unify the armed services under a single Department of Defense and a single Secretary of Defense, a goal Truman had been striving for since taking office. It also established the Air Force as a separate military service, set up a new National Security Council, and gave formal authorization to the Central Intelligence Agency. 4. Though he felt she needed more training before making a professional debut as a concert singer, Truman had supported his adored daughter Margaret in her ambitions all along. So also had her Aunt Mary Jane and Mama Truman, who had been the most enthusiastic, telling her to go at it hammer and tongs. Bess, however, was not pleased, and Grandmother Wallace declared that the stage was no life for a lady. If she wants to be a warbler and has the talent and will do the hard work necessary to accomplish her purpose, I don't suppose I should kick, Truman had written to his mother and sister. She's one nice girl, he told them in another letter, and I'm so glad she hasn't turned out like Alice Roosevelt and a couple of the Wilson daughters. To Margaret, he wrote that it took work, and more work to get satisfactory results, as your pop can testify. She talked for a while of singing under the name of Margaret Wallace so as not to appear to be capitalizing on his position. But Mama Truman, extremely displeased, couldn't understand any name being substituted for Truman. Since the start of the year, Margaret had been living in a small apartment overlooking Central Park in New York, working with her Kansas City teacher, Mrs. Thomas J. Strickler, who also stayed with her in the apartment as chaperone. Truman felt her absence acutely. Like his mother's precarious condition since her fall in February, it gave him a feeling of emptiness not easy to face. While he was so intensely preoccupied with his responsibilities, time was moving on, life passing him by. For someone who had spent so much of his life in such male-dominated vocations as the military and politics, he had few close male friends and no real confidants among the men he knew or worked with, any more now than in boyhood. It was the 4 women in his life, Bess, Mama, Mary Jane, and Margaret, who mattered above all, whose company and approval he most valued and needed. Now 2 of them, Mama and Margaret, appeared to be deserting him. Margaret went to New York yesterday, and it leaves a blank place here, he had written to his mother and sister in January 1947. But I guess the parting time has to come to everybody. In early March, with her first performance in the offing, she received a quick note from him. Here's a little dough in case you need railroad tickets to some mysterious town. Now don't get scared, you can do it, and if anyone says you can't, I'll bust him in the snoot. Margaret Truman, a coloratura soprano, made her radio debut in Detroit on March 16, 1947, as a guest on the Ford Motor Company's Sunday evening hour with the Detroit Symphony conducted by Carl Kruger. As reported in the papers, possibly no vocal performer in history had ever appeared for the first time under such pressure or before so big an audience and so many critics. The broadcast was nationwide on ABC, and reportedly 15 million people were listening, making it the largest radio audience ever for such a performance. She could not help realizing, observed the New York Times, that not only the immense listening public, but every vocalist, every singing teacher and vocal student who has access to a radio set was critically appraising her voice and her interpretations. In addition, singing with an orchestra was a new experience for her. Scheduled to have appeared on the program the week before, she'd had to back out at the last minute because of a sudden attack of throat and chest pains, diagnosed by Wallace Graham as bronchial pneumonia. Truman was in Key West the night of the broadcast, still resting after his March 12th speech to Congress. The half hour he spent sitting by the radio, waiting for Margaret's turn on the show to come, was, he said afterward, as long as any he could remember. Perhaps, she later wrote, sheer naivete saw me through. She was the first daughter of a president ever to attempt a professional career of her own. I was aware that my father was glued to a radio in the Navy Commandant's quarters in Key West, that my mother was listening in the White House, that Mama Truman was listening from her bed in Grandview, and that Grandmother Wallace, who didn't have much use for the stage, was listening critically in Independence. I couldn't let anybody down. She sang 3 selections, beginning with the Spanish folk song Cielito Lindo, then an aria from Félicien David's L'Arrêt du Brésil, and finishing with The Last Rose of Summer, a request of her father's. The orchestra indicated its approval with spontaneous applause, and though the Detroit Times said she sang no better than a fairly talented student, the reviews were generally good, kinder than she deserved, she later acknowledged. Noel Strauss, music critic for the New York Times, described her voice as interesting and said she had shown remarkable poise and self-control considering the pressures she was under. Her phrasing was careful, the legato smooth throughout. Miss Truman's work from start to finish, the reviewer concluded in a judgment that greatly pleased her father, had an allure that resulted from deep sincerity and an unaffected simplicity of approach. At home in Kansas City, to the delight of her father, the star praised her for her courage and called it a highly agreeable occasion. The White House switchboard was so engulfed by calls of approval that it had to close down temporarily. To reporters gathered around at Key West, Truman said he thought she had done wonderfully, and for weeks after his return to Washington it was obvious that nothing pleased him quite so much as to have visitors mention they had heard Margaret on the radio and enjoyed her singing. Another performance, a full concert this time, was scheduled for May in Pittsburgh. Truman wanted only success for Margaret, but by no means should she become a prima donna. "Wish I could go along and smooth all the rough spots, but I can't, and in a career you must learn to overcome the obstacles without blowing up. Always be nice to the people who can't talk back to you. I can't stand a man or woman who bawls out underlings to satisfy an ego." The Pittsburgh concert had to be postponed at the last minute, however, when word came that Mama Truman had suffered a stroke and was not expected to live. Truman flew from Washington immediately. It was his 5th trip home since his mother first fell and broke her hip. Ross, Wallace Graham, the whole presidential entourage were with him and set up headquarters on the 11th floor of the Muehlebach Hotel. Mama seemed to improve, knowing he was there, and he stayed on at the Muehlebach for nearly 2 weeks, driving out from Kansas City to Grandview every day. The weather was poor, chill, and raining, and she slept most of the time. As the papers said, the eyes of the world were focused on the small yellow clapboard house day after day. Truman worked at the mission oak table in the parlor. It was then that he signed the bill for aid to Greece and Turkey. "Whenever she wakes up," he told reporters, "she wants to talk to me. I want to be there." But then, to everyone's amazement, she made a comeback, and Truman returned to Washington. He called her nearly every day thereafter, returned for another visit in mid-June, and wrote regularly to Mary Jane, who would read the letters aloud from Mama. He kept her posted on politics, as he knew she liked. "I've come to the conclusion that Taft is no good and Hartley is worse," he wrote. He also warned her that he was about to make a speech she wouldn't like. It was for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He would be quoting Abraham Lincoln, he said. Delivered from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial on June 29th to a crowd of 10,000 people, it was the strongest statement on civil rights heard in Washington since the time of Lincoln, and the first speech ever by a president to the NAACP. "Full civil rights and freedom must be obtained and guaranteed for all Americans," Truman said, with Walter White, head of the NAACP, standing beside him. "When I say all Americans, I mean all Americans. Many of our people still suffer the indignity of insult, the narrowing fear of intimidation, and I regret to say the threat of physical and mob violence. Prejudice and intolerance in which these evils are rooted still exist. The conscience of our nation and the legal machinery which enforces it have not yet secured to each citizen full freedom of fear. We cannot wait another decade or another generation to remedy these evils. We must work as never before to cure them now." He called for state and federal action against lynching and the poll tax, an end to inequality in education, employment, the whole caste system based on race or color. That someone of his background from western Missouri could be standing at the shrine of the great emancipator saying such things was almost inconceivable. As he listened, Walter White thought of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. "I did not believe that Truman's speech possessed the literary quality of Lincoln's speech," he later wrote, "but in some respects it had been a more courageous one in its specific condemnation of evils based upon race prejudice and its call for immediate action against them." Late in 1946, at the urging of White and others, Truman had established his own Blue Ribbon Commission on Civil Rights, with Charles E. Wilson, the head of General Electric, as chairman. It was an unprecedented step, and Truman, White was sure, had put his political fortunes on the line. Almost without exception, White wrote, Mr. Truman's political advisers from both South and North were certain that his authorization of inquiry into the explosive issue of civil rights was nothing short of political suicide. Mr. Truman stood firm. The report of the commission would not be ready until October. Taking his seat again after the speech, Truman turned to White and said he meant every word of it, and I'm going to prove that I do mean it. To his mother, Truman said it was a speech he wished he did not have to make. But I believe what I say, he told her, and I'm hopeful we may implement it. He described for her the flowers in bloom at the White House down in the yard. With so much wet weather, were Vivian's sons able to get in the hay crop, he wanted to know. He was thinking more than usual about times gone by. The morning of July 26th, writing to Bess in Independence, he found himself reminiscing about Uncle Harrison and about Tasker Taylor, their high school classmate who had drowned in the Missouri River after graduation. July 26th had always been known to Missouri farmers as Turnip Day, the day to sow turnips, he told Bess. Once in 1901, a particularly dry year, Uncle Harrison had walked into the seed store and declared he needed 6 bushels of turnip seed. Asked why so large an amount, Uncle Harrison said he understood turnips were 90% water and that maybe if he planted the whole farm in them, the drought would break. But he must not dwell on the past. You see, age is creeping up on me. Mama is 94 and a half because she never lived in the past. An hour or so later, Mary Jane telephoned from Grandview to say Mama had pneumonia and might not live through the day. Truman ordered his plane made ready, but there was a delay. He wanted to sign the National Security Act and name James Forrestal the new Secretary of Defense before Congress recessed. A few congressional signatures were still needed. At the airport, he held off departure, waiting beside the plane for nearly an hour until the bill was brought to him. Minutes later, the plane was airborne. Somewhere over Ohio, dozing on a cot in his stateroom, he dreamt Mama came to him and said, "Goodbye, Harry. Be a good boy." He later wrote, "When Dr. Graham came into my room on the Sacred Cow, I knew what he would say." She had died at 11:30 that morning. Well, now she won't have to suffer any more, Truman said. For the rest of the flight he sat by the window looking down at the checkerboard landscape and saying nothing. Martha Ellen Young Truman had been born in 1852, when Millard Fillmore was president, when Abraham Lincoln was still a circuit lawyer in Illinois, when her idolized Robert E. Lee was superintendent at West Point, overseeing the education of young men from both North and South. She had seen wagon trains coming and going on the Santa Fe Trail. She had been through Civil War, survived Order No. 11, survived grasshopper plagues, flood, drought, the failures and death of her husband, the Great Depression, eviction from her own home. She had lived to see the advent of the telephone, electric light, the automobile, the airplane, radio, movies, television, short skirts, world wars, and her adored eldest son sitting at his desk in the White House as President of the United States. As Margaret would write in memory of her country grandmother some years later, everything had changed around her, but Mama Truman had never changed. Her philosophy was simple. You knew right from wrong, and you did right, and you always did your best. That's all there was to it. The funeral at the house in Grandview was simple and private. She was buried on the hillside at the Forest Hill Cemetery next to her husband. A few days later in Washington, Truman asked Charlie Ross to bring the White House press into the Oval Office. "I couldn't hold a press conference this week," Truman began quietly when they were assembled. "But I wanted to say to you personally a thing or two that I couldn't very well say any other way, so I asked Charlie to ask you to come in. I wanted to express to you all and to your editors and publishers appreciation for the kindness to me during the last week. I was particularly anxious to tell the photographers how nice they were to me and to the family, and I didn't know any other way to do it but just call you in and tell you. I had no news to give you or anything else to say to you except just that, and I felt like I owed it to you. You've been exceedingly nice to me all during the whole business, and I hope you believe it when I say to you that it is from the heart when I tell you that." To Margaret, he wrote, "Someday you'll be an orphan just as your dad is now." Later, when she was on tour, he would tell her, "You should call your mama and dad every time you arrive in a town. Someday, maybe, you'll understand what torture it is to be worried about the only person in the world that counts. You should know by now that your dad has only 3 such persons, your ma, you, and your Aunt Mary." On August 24th, Margaret sang at the Hollywood Bowl before 19,000 people. To the Los Angeles Times, her performance was only satisfactory, but the audience brought her back for 7 curtain calls. On October 17th, she returned to Pittsburgh to make her first full-length concert appearance at the city's immense old Syria Mosque Auditorium before a full house that included her mother, who was hearing her sing in public for the first time. Truman stayed away because he wanted Margaret to have all the attention. Again, her stage presence and rapport with the audience were remarkable for someone so young and inexperienced. The audience loved her. She had 9 curtain calls, sang 3 encores. Everyone seemed to be pulling for her, even the ushers and the press, wrote the music editor of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, Donald Steinfurst. You felt it in the waves of kindly feelings directed to this girl, standing assuredly with complete poise, over the footlights, in the spotlight. You wanted to feel that this young girl, who gave up most of the pleasures of White House living, if any such there might be, for a career in music, would realize her life's ambitions. She was wearing a full-length, off-the-shoulder gown of pink taffeta, her blonde hair in soft curls, and she sang, as she had in Detroit and Los Angeles, as if she were enjoying every moment. But this time the critics were considerably less kind. The bold fact is, wrote Steinfurst, that Miss Truman, judging from last night's performance and with the usual allowances for youth and debut, is not a great singer, and in fact is not at this stage of her career even a good singer. She is a young woman of a great deal of personal charm, considerable stage presence, apparently a fair knowledge of the fundamentals of singing, but she is not an artist by commonly accepted standards. Others said she had launched her career too soon before she was ready, just as her father had worried she might. The critic in the Pittsburgh Press thought her training very faulty. I called up Daddy after the concert, and he seemed to be satisfied, she remembered. I can't say I was. The tour went on. She sang in Fort Worth, Amarillo, Oklahoma City, Shreveport, and Tulsa, and she did better. Margaret seems to be making a hit wherever she goes, Truman reported to Mary Jane. Fort Worth was a sellout, so was Amarillo. All the same, he wished she would come home and stay. Sometimes, relaxing with friends, Truman liked to say that he and his small family might have been a hit as a vaudeville team. Margaret would sing, he would play the piano, and Bess would manage the act. He would then grin at Bess while she responded with a skeptical look. It had become a family joke. To those who knew Bess well, the manager's role was perfect casting and greatly to her husband's advantage. Margaret spoke of her mother as the spark plug of the family. Truman himself said many times he seldom made a decision without consulting the boss. She had no more interest than ever in the limelight of public life, no desire to play any part beyond that of wife and mother. Old friends from Independence or members of the White House domestic staff who saw her on an almost daily basis would speak warmly of her kindness, her rollicking sense of humor. She would laugh so hard her whole body would shake. Laugh, remembered one of the servants, Lillian Parks, as if she had invented laughter. No First Lady in memory had been so attentive to the welfare of the servants, and particularly in the summer months, before the advent of air conditioning in the White House. "It's too hot to work," she would say. If it wasn't hot, remembered Lillian Parks, she'd say, "You've been working too long, stop now." She was the kind of First Lady who hated fussiness, loved cleanliness and neatness, and an all-things-put-away look, but who didn't want her servants to keep working all the time and would order them to rest. To nearly everyone she seemed the perfect lady, the phrase used so often to describe her mother. "She's the only lady I know who writes a thank-you note for a Christmas card, and she writes it in a beautiful hand," a Kansas City friend would tell a reporter. Marquis Childs of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch called her the perfect Missouri lady. Once when Childs and his wife gave a party at their Washington home for a poet who was an old friend, they invited the Trumans. Mrs. Truman came with great apologies for her husband, who just couldn't possibly get away, Childs remembered. And the wife of the poet had too much libation and had to be taken off somewhere, put to bed somewhere. But Mrs. Truman was very polite and never made any fuss of this at all. She was a very proper woman. I think her whole life was Harry Truman. Rachel Odom, her secretary, remembered Bess as the white gloves type. Serene, shy, and stubborn were other words used often to portray her. California Congressman Richard Nixon and his wife, attending their first White House reception, were impressed by the way both the President and Mrs. Truman made them feel at home. They both had the gift of being dignified without putting on airs, Nixon wrote. Press accounts habitually described Mrs. Truman as plain. What impressed us most was that she was genuine. The longer people knew her, the more they appreciated her quiet strength and quality. Among her greatest admirers were Robert A. Lovett and his wife. Lovett, who at the end of June 1947 replaced Dean Acheson as Undersecretary of State, was a suave, urbane New York investment banker, a partner at Brown Brothers Harriman, and a Yale graduate like Harriman and Acheson. To Lovett, there was no question about the importance of Bess Truman. "She was one of the finest women I ever saw in my life," Lovett remembered. "And of course, she helped Truman immeasurably. My wife and I absolutely loved her. She was simply superb." Clark Clifford would later describe her as a pillar of strength to her husband and credit her with better insight than her husband into the quality and trustworthiness of people who had gathered around him. But if Truman relied on her, as he himself also attested, she clearly was extremely dependent on him. Years later, when asked by a friend what she considered the most memorable aspect of her life, Bess answered at once, "Harry and I have been sweethearts and married more than 40 years, and no matter where I was, when I put out my hand, Harry's was there to grasp it." 5'4" and stout, Bess Truman stood as straight as a drum major, head up, shoulders squared. She dressed simply and conservatively. There was nothing ever in any way mannered or pretentious about her. Throughout her years in Washington, as Jonathan Daniels reported, she laughed at nothing so heartily as the sudden pretensions of some officials' wives. She was exactly as she had always been and saw no reason to change because she had become First Lady. Some guests at the White House found her so natural and unprepossessing they had to remind themselves to whom they were speaking. Time said somewhat condescendingly that with her neatly waved gray hair and unobtrusive clothes, she would have blended perfectly with the crowd at an A&P. Asked once by reporters for his view of her appearance, Truman said he thought she looked exactly as a woman her age ought to look. Many people, meeting Bess Truman for the first time, were surprised by how much younger and more attractive she appeared than in photographs, where her expression was often somber, even disapproving. Something seemed to come over her in public, and particularly when photographers pressed in on her. In receiving lines, she often looked bored, even pained, as if her feet hurt, a very different person from the one her friends knew. A Louisiana congressman's wife, Linda Boggs, would remember how vivacious the First Lady could be while arranging things for a reception, what delightful company she was behind the scenes. And then, the minute the doors would open and all those people would begin to come in, she would freeze, and she looked like old Stoneface. Instead of being the outgoing, warm, and lovely woman that she had been previously, the huge crowds simply made her sort of pull up into herself. Where Eleanor Roosevelt had seen her role as public and complementary to that of her husband, Bess insisted on remaining in the background. Propriety was a much stronger influence in her life than in Mrs. Roosevelt's, remembered Alice Acheson, the wife of Dean Acheson. It was widely known that Bess played cards. Her bridge club from Independence had made a trip to Washington in the spring of 1946, stayed several days at the White House, and was the subject of much attention in the papers, and that she and Margaret, unlike the president, were movie fans. Bess also loved reading mysteries and was wild about baseball, going to every Senators game she could fit into her schedule. But she had no interesting hobbies for reporters to write about, no winsome pets, no social causes to champion or opinions on issues she wished to voice publicly. Her distaste for publicity was plain and, to many, endearing. She refused repeatedly to make speeches or give private interviews or to hold a press conference, no matter how often reporters protested. "Just keep on smiling and tell them nothing," she advised Rachel Odom. She didn't want to discuss her life, Margaret remembered. 2 early public appearances had turned into embarrassments. She had been asked to christen an army plane, but no one had bothered to score the champagne bottle in advance so it would break easily. She swung it against the plane with no result, then kept trying again and again, her face a study in crimson determination. The crowd roared with laughter until finally a mechanic stepped in and broke the bottle for her. Truman, too, had been amused, as was the country when the newsreel played in the movie theaters, but not Bess, who reportedly told him later that she was sorry she hadn't swung that bottle at him. The other episode concerned her acceptance in the fall of 1945 of an invitation to tea from the Daughters of the American Revolution at Constitution Hall, a decision protested vehemently by Adam Clayton Powell, the flamboyant black congressman and minister of the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem, whose wife, the pianist Hazel Scott, had been denied permission to perform at Constitution Hall because of her race. Bess, however, refused to change her mind. The invitation, as she wrote to Powell, had come before the unfortunate controversy, and her acceptance of such hospitality was not related to the merits of the issue. She deplored, she said, any action that denied artistic opportunity because of race prejudice. She was not a segregationist, but she was not a crusader either. Powell responded by referring to her publicly as the last lady of the land, which caused Truman to explode over that damn nigger preacher at a staff meeting, And like Clare Boothe Luce, Powell would never be invited to the White House. When at last, in the fall of 1947, Bess agreed to respond to a questionnaire from reporters, her answers were characteristically definite and memorable. What qualities did she think would be the greatest asset to the wife of a president? Good health and a well-developed sense of humor. Did she think there would ever be a woman president of the United States? No. Would she want to be president? No. Would she want Margaret ever to be First Lady? No. If she had a son, would she try to bring him up to be president? No. If it had been left to her own free choice, would she have gone into the White House in the first place? Most definitely would not have. What was her reaction to musical criticism of Margaret's singing? No comment. Did any of the demands of her role as First Lady ever give her stage fright? No comment. What would you like to do and have your husband do when he is no longer president? Return to independence. She seems to think Harry ought to run the country, not her, a Washington cab driver was quoted as saying. It was a sentiment widely shared, and according to Jonathan Daniels, Truman conspired willingly with her to protect her privacy. Asked once if she was interested in any particular period of White House history, Bess said the Monroe years, an interesting observation that the press passed by. James Monroe's wife, another Elizabeth Courtright Monroe, had followed the gregarious Dolly Madison, who had been as much the center of attention in her time as had Eleanor Roosevelt. A quiet aristocrat, Elizabeth Monroe married a hard-drinking politician and made a good marriage. In the White House, she had insisted on keeping her life a private matter. As manager of household expenses, Bess was extremely frugal. She cut back on the size of the White House staff. Mrs. Nesbitt, the elderly housekeeper responsible for years of dreary food on the Roosevelt table, had been sent packing, with the result that both the cooking and the housekeeping improved. Most objectionable had been the cold, hard dinner rolls, long a White House staple, but which to anyone raised as Bess had been on traditional hot Southern biscuits baked with Wagner Gates' Queen of the Pantry flour, were altogether inedible. It was only on the command of President Truman, wrote the American correspondent for the BBC, Alistair Cook, that her recipe was passed on to the chef, and the Trumans reverted to breaking the bread of their fathers. Mrs. Truman was no fussier than her predecessor. It was just that she had been brought up to be house-proud, recorded J.B. West. She kept close watch on the cost of food, kept her own books, went over all the household bills with a fine-tooth comb, and wrote every check herself. According to West and Lillian Parks, both of whom later wrote books about their years of service in the White House, the staff felt closer to the Trumans than to any of the other presidents and their wives, which was saying a great deal, considering how long some of the staff had been employed. John Mays, a doorman who also cut Truman's hair every 2 weeks, had been on duty at the White House since the time of Woodrow Wilson. The way the Trumans lived, remembered West, the White House might as well have been in Independence. As far as everyday living goes, they were no different. And for all the president's talk of not liking life in the White House, said West, he liked living there better than living in his mother-in-law's house in Independence. Truman's salary in his last years in the Senate, plus what Bess had earned, came to $14,500. As vice president, his pay was $20,000. As president, it was $75,000. But nearly half of that would go to taxes, and while the government paid for the White House servants, Bess had to pay for their food, plus all meals for the family and guests. In Roosevelt's time, monthly food bills alone sometimes reached $7,000. Bess had been able to cut that back to about $2,000. In their 12 years in the White House, the Roosevelts had never lived within the president's salary, but the Trumans had no family fortune to fall back on. Margaret would later describe her mother as a chronic penny pincher of necessity. Still, she was able to save very little year to year. After expenses and taxes on his $75,000 salary, it was reported, the president had about $4,200 left. In a smart Washington dress shop, browsing one day with Mrs. John Snyder, Bess told the sales clerk mildly but firmly there was no use for her to try on anything since she couldn't afford the prices. According to J.B. West, Bess guarded her privacy like a precious jewel, yet within that privacy played a role far exceeding what any but a few suspected. She did indeed advise Truman on decisions. and he listened to her. Margaret would later write that in her father's first months in office, Bess had felt shut out of his life, more and more superfluous, and especially after the realization that he had not discussed with her his decision on the atomic bomb. The feeling of being left out, wrote Margaret, combined with Bess's original opposition to Truman's ever becoming president, to build a smoldering anger that was tantamount to an emotional separation, which may explain some of her long absences from Washington. Still, Margaret, too, would stress her mother's influence on her father, saying he constantly talked things over with Bess and would often do as she said. He was very, very conscious of her views and needed her approval. "Have you ever noticed Father when he's with Mother at any sort of public gathering?" Margaret remarked to a reporter at the time. "He's always trying to catch her glance to see if she approves of what he is saying or doing." She remained, as she had been for more than 30 years, the most important person in his life. Among family and old friends, he freely acknowledged the difference Miss Lizzie had made to the course of his life. "Suppose Miss Lizzie had gone off with Mr. Young, Julian Harvey, or Harris," he wrote to Ethel Noland from the White House, recalling old suitors from days long past. "What would have been the result? For Harry, I mean. He probably would have been either a prominent farmer in Jackson County or a major general in the regular army." To judge by the letters he wrote to Bess in the fall of 1947, while she was with her mother in Independence, he did indeed want her to know his mind and the details of the problems he faced in a topsy-turvy world. He was preoccupied with the immense projected cost of the Marshall Plan. "Marshall and Lovett were in yesterday and went over the European situation from soup to nuts with me. If it works out as planned, it will cost us about $16 billion over a 4-year period. This amount of $16 billion is just the amount of the national debt when Franklin took over. He ran it up to 40-odd, and then the war came along, and it is 257, but we can't understand those figures anyway." A few days later, on September 30th, he went on, telling her more. "Yesterday was one of the most hectic of days. I'm not sure what has been my worst day. But here is the situation fraught with terrible consequences. Suppose, for instance, that Italy should fold up and that Tito then would march into the Po Valley. All the Mediterranean coast of France then is open to Russian occupation, and the Iron Curtain comes to Bordeaux, Calais, Antwerp, and The Hague. We withdraw from Greece and Turkey and prepare for war. It just must not happen. But here I am confronted with a violently opposition Congress, whose committees, with few exceptions, are living in 1890. It is not representative of the country's thinking at all. But I've got a job, and it must be done, win, lose, or draw." Sent letters to Tabor, Bridges, Vandenberg, and Eaton, requesting them to call their committees together as soon as possible. Had my food committee together and will make a radio speech Sunday. To feed France and Italy this winter will cost $580 million. The Marshall Plan, $16.5 billion. But you know, in October and November of 1945, I canceled $63 billion in appropriations, $55 billion at one crack. Our war cost that year was set at $105 billion. The 16.5 is for a 4-year period and is for peace. A Russian war would cost us $400 billion and untold lives, mostly civilian. So I must do what I can. I shouldn't write you this stuff, but you should know what I've been facing. I haven't resumed my walks yet, but will in a day or two. Too much to read. General Bradley made a report to me today on his European trip, and he remarked on my having had to make more momentous decisions than nearly any other president. He's right, and I hope most of them have been right. In a month's time that fall, he wrote 22 letters to her. That he adored her as much as ever was also among his reasons for the letters. The following June, on their anniversary, he would write, "Dear Bess, 29 years. It seems like 29 days. Detroit, Port Huron, a farm sale, the Blackstone Hotel, a shirt store. County judge, defeat, Margie, Automobile Club membership drive. Presiding judge, senator, VP, now. You still are on the pedestal where I placed you that day in Sunday school in 1890. What an old fool I am." Except for Besant Margaret and his secretary, Rose Conway, few women ever had the opportunity to observe Truman close at hand or privately. There were no women on his staff in any but secretarial roles, none who sat in on staff meetings or who worked with him or accompanied him beyond the White House. But in that crucial year of 1947, a young Austrian-born artist named Greta Kempton came to the West Wing and, with the help of 2 Secret Service agents, set up her heavy wooden easel in the cabinet room. She was the first woman who had ever been invited to do a presidential portrait, Truman's official White House portrait, as it would turn out, and she had never met the president. In all, there would be 5 sittings. I was very impressed with him, she remembered. He came in. I asked him to sit down. He had some papers, but I told him he couldn't study papers. "Oh, no," I said. "This is the time I'm working. You are going to relax." Unaware that the 2 who had helped her get set up were Secret Service men, she turned and said there would be nothing more, they needn't stay. Truman, amused, nodded to them, and they left. He sat down, and I could only see a big, important man and a big, important portrait. I had to switch canvases. It had to be bigger. The smaller the person, the more against posing they are, the more they feel they're doing you a favor. Not Mr. Truman. He never seemed irritated or annoyed, never seemed impatient. He would settle down. The room seemed to take on a feeling of grandeur and peacefulness. I felt very inspired. He was always helpful. He wanted the finished portrait to be as good as I could possibly make it. The more he sat, the more interested he became in the work, my work, the technique of painting, the canvas. He took a serious interest. She had told him at the start that under no circumstances was he to see the portrait until it was finished. But once, during a break, he decided to take a little walk around the enormous cabinet table, his direction, as she remembered, easing toward the canvas. Sensing what he was up to, she told him again there could be no peeking. "You mean I can't have a look at my own portrait?" he said. She told him no, and with good grace he went back to his chair. When she had finished and asked if he would like to take a look, he stood in front of the easel for several minutes. "Well, I certainly do like that," he said, "but of course I wouldn't really know. I'll have to ask the boss." He telephoned Bess, who came at once, looked at the picture, and heartily approved. It was exactly as she saw him herself, she said. Against a darkening sky, he sat foursquare, unsmiling, jaw firm, hands at rest on the arms of a wooden chair, a figure of strength and determination in a dark double-breasted suit, white shirt, dark striped tie, the familiar handkerchief in place, the service pin on his lapel, and in the distance the Capitol dome. Now and then during the sittings, Greta Kempton remembered, he had seemed a little hurried, but in general I felt he had a great confidence in himself, as if, "I know what I'm doing," but also some humbleness. I think he was very even. In the summer of 1947, in the journal Foreign Affairs, George Kennan had published an article in which he introduced the idea of containment, an expression already in use at the State Department by then. Kennan recommended a policy of firm containment of Russia, with unalterable counterforce at every point where the Russians show signs of encroaching, until the Soviet Union either mellows or collapses. The article was signed simply X, but the identity of the author was known soon enough, and in another few months Walter Lippmann issued his own strong rebuttal to the concept in a book called The Cold War, an expression Bernard Baruch had used earlier in a speech, but that now, like the Iron Curtain, became part of the post-war vocabulary. When and why the Cold War began, whether with announcement of the Truman Doctrine, or earlier when Truman first confronted Molotov, or perhaps with the eventual sanction of the Marshall Plan by Congress, would be the subject of much consideration in years to come. But the clearest dividing point between what American policy toward the Soviets had been since the war and what it would now become was George Marshall's return from Moscow. The change came on April 26, 1947, when Marshall, of all men, reported to Truman what Truman had already privately concluded, that diplomacy wasn't going to work, that the Russians could not be dealt with, that they wanted only drift and chaos and the collapse of Europe to suit their own purposes. Chip Olin, who had been witness to so much, Molotov's first call on Truman in the Oval Office, the meetings at Potsdam, Marshall's pivotal session with Stalin at the Kremlin, said the Cold War could really be traced to the seizure of power by the Bolsheviks in 1917. It had begun then, 30 years before. Truman, looking back on his first years in office and the decisions he had made, would regret especially that he had been unable to stop wholesale demobilization after the war ended. It had been a grave mistake, he felt. The Cold War was an expression he never much cared for and seldom used. He called it the War of Nerves. In later years he would be charged with acting too impulsively and harshly with the Russians, with making snap judgments as a new president, without the benefit of experience or understanding. But patience, I think, must be our watchword if we are to have world peace, he had written to Eleanor Roosevelt less than a month after assuming office, and in fact it had taken 2 years to arrive at a policy toward the Soviets. He had moved slowly, perhaps too slowly, and always with the close counsel of the same people Franklin Roosevelt too had counted on, and particularly George Marshall. In September, Truman received a handwritten note from Churchill to say, "How much I admire the policy into which you have guided your great country, and to thank you from the bottom of my heart for all you are doing to save the world from famine and war." In a note of thanks, Truman said no man could carry the burden of the presidency and do it all right, but that he had good men around him now. In mid-October, at an informal meeting in his office with newspaper editorial writers from around the country, he spent most of the time expounding on the vital need for the Marshall Plan. At the end, he was asked whether the United States would ever get any credit for sending this stuff to Europe. "I'm not doing this for credit," Truman answered. "I'm doing it because it's right. I'm doing it because it's necessary to be done if we are going to survive ourselves." The Marshall Plan was voted on by Congress in April 1948, almost a year after Marshall's speech at Harvard, and passed by overwhelming majorities in both houses. It was a singular triumph for the administration, the central gem in the cluster of great and fruitful decisions made by President Truman, as Arthur Crock would write. Indeed, it was to be one of the great American achievements of the century, as nearly everyone eventually saw. "In all the history of the world," Truman wrote privately a few days after final passage of the program, "we are the first great nation to feed and support the conquered. We are the first great nation to create independent republics from conquered territory, Cuba and the Philippines. Our neighbors are not afraid of us. Their borders have no forts, no soldiers, no tanks, no big guns lined up. The United States wanted peace in the world, and the United States would be prepared for trouble if it comes."